Thank you, Beata, and deep bows of gratitude to all of you for joining us today. Just as a minor technical note, if throughout this presentation any ideas or questions or doubts arise, please feel free to share them in the chat. And if you don't feel comfortable sharing with the entire group, you can always send a message to me privately. I will read it out and try to address it at an appropriate moment in time, sometimes waiting a little bit till we reach that point, that specific point in the discussion, sometimes addressing a specific query immediately. But in general, this is hopefully a friendly exchange and an opportunity for us to be playful with the material, not in a frivolous and silly way, because of course we're talking about practices that have been in use for at least 1600 years, potentially much more. But just in terms of seeing how all of this can be applicable to our lives, to our spiritual journeys, to our contemplative practice. And because we are all coming from very different backgrounds, because some of us would maybe have decades of White Tara practice or Vajrayana practice behind us, and some of us are hearing about these concepts and ideas for the first time, there's two invitations that I would like to extend to all of us, including myself. One of them is for us to try to use the so-called beginner's mind, in which we try to see all of these concepts, ideas, images, slides, whatever it is that we're discussing, anew, as if all of these things are new to us, and we're just trying to see whether they make any sense and whether there's any practical applicability in them. And the second invitation is indeed to focus on the practical application and to think, well, by the end of the session, what is it that I can use here? Was there anything at all that seems particularly interesting? And some people would be perhaps fascinated by the discussion of the lineage for the specific practice. That's where I find myself. Personally, I'm a historian. I like the Dharma in terms of Dharma's history. I really genuinely enjoy reading the biographies and hagiographies of great masters. There's one book in particular called Blazing Splendor, which is a collection of memories from the great master of the 20th century, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, compiled by his translators, Erik Pema Kunsang and Marcia Bender-Schmidt, and then edited by Dan Goleman, who many of you would know from his work with Emotional Intelligence. That's a book that collects stories, and that's a book that I've read over 100 times, and will probably read, if I live long enough, 100 times more, just because it's just such an enjoyable read for me. So I really do enjoy Dharma history, and I find a lot of inspiration, a lot of practical lessons within that. But some people couldn't be less enthused about those things. That's not what they're here for. They are interested in the practical instructions. They're interested in the practice itself, but the history of it all seems a little bit secondary. So if that's you, just wait for the part when we start talking about the practical applications. If you are inspired by these historical discussions, which of course play a large role in establishing the authenticity of the Dharma and making sure we're not approaching the Dharma with a colonial view of it, that's we're not just saying, oh, it doesn't matter what all these Tibetan practitioners and Indian practitioners and Himalayan practitioners and Mongolian practitioners were doing. It doesn't matter. They didn't know anything. I'm going to establish my own brand of Dharma, and I'm going to figure out what's right and what's wrong. So to avoid that, it is actually quite important to look at the history of it all. And that's what we're going to do as well. But at the end of it all, at the end of the day, we just want to find something that would speak to us, that would be practically applicable. And since some of you potentially were present for recent teachings with Venerable Rabina Kurtin, with her presentations for Tibet House, I think you would have probably picked up one of the most important things that she always shares, and that is that we're approaching the Dharma as a working hypothesis, and the emphasis there is to find something that would work for us, that would help us become more stable, clear, comfortable, happy, compassionate, loving, joyful, wise, yada, yada, yada. So hopefully we will find something that speaks to us. And if not, And the suggestion, as one of my teachers, Most Venerable Chikanim Rinpoche, sometimes says, is just to eat fruit. That's what he said one time. One time he transmitted entire empowerment. He talked about the commitments for that empowerment. Some people said, yeah, I don't think I can do that. That's too much. You've been reciting this mantra 100 times a day, which takes about 3 minutes. Still too much for me. And Chikanim Rinpoche said, well, he put a grape in his mouth and he said, well, in that case, just eat fruit. What else is there to say? Just enjoy life, take it easy. Don't worry. So yeah, no pressure. But in the spirit of finding practical applicability, in finding something that could be of benefit, we can start by doing a preliminary meditation, which in itself would be a wonderful way of applying the instructions of the great masters for this tradition. One of the greatest masters, although he's not always directly connected to White Tara practice, was, of course, Padmasambhava, also known as Guru Rinpoche, the first great master to bring Vajrayana teachings to Tibet in particular. And one of his most quintessential instructions, preserved in some of the so-called treasure cycles, is his instruction on settling our body, speech, and mind in their natural states, basically establishing a profound sense of ease, rest, and stability before we start doing anything else Dharma related. So let's experiment with that a little bit by doing this meditation and applying 2 ways of settling our body, speech, and mind in their natural states. And for that, I would invite all of us to find a comfortable stationary position, which can be upright, if that feels comfortable, or can be supine. Some people would feel better meditating lying flat on their backs in the so-called Shavasana posture. That's perfectly fine for this specific meditation. So just adopt a posture that would be comfortable for you personally. Make a choice with regards to your camera, whether you want to keep it on or off for the duration of this meditation, either sharing your presence or going into a tiny bubble of personal space for the length of this practice. And then after that, we can all take a few moments to observe the body and to adjust the different parts of our body so that the body in general becomes a wonderful vessel or a wonderful mandala supporting our meditation practice. So with our attention, with our awareness, we're finding the central axis of the body, which is our spine. And then we can take some moments to elongate the spine very gently. That would be available to us whether we are in the upright position or on our back, just establishing a certain degree of spaciousness there. And then taking some moments to also comfortably position our shoulders, our hands, our legs, our chin. If we're sitting in an upright position, our chin would be leveled with the floor and then just slightly tucked in. And then, because this would be primarily a relaxation practice for our eyes, we can keep them closed if that feels appropriate, or keep them partially open, allowing some light to come and bring clarity to our system. Or we can keep our eyes fully open, just gazing into the space in front of us and not focusing on anything in particular. And with that, our attention would go to the tactile experiences of the body. The tactile sensations in our feet and toes. Where we are noticing the sensations and then taking some moments to establish a profound sense of ease, releasing tension, releasing muscle tension in particular. And then our legs in general, from our feet all the way up to our thighs and our hips. Checking the sensations, releasing muscle tension. Then the same with our abdominal area. Checking to see if there's any residual or habitual tension there, releasing that tension if possible, or just noticing it. And then coming up to our chest. Exploring our shoulders. And then going down the arms, through the elbow, to the sensations in our forearms, and then in our hands and fingers. Establishing a profound sense of ease and natural stillness there. And then coming up to our shoulders once again, moving on to our neck and throat. And spending some time with our face. Then expanding our awareness so that it can encompass the entirety of the body with all of its tactile experiences. And in particular, noticing the tactile sensations associated with the process of breathing. Allowing the tension to leave our body with each natural exhalation. And using the inhalation to bring greater clarity, greater awareness to the changing sensations. Releasing with the out-breath, focusing with the in-breath, without trying to manipulate the breath itself in any way. Through that, our body might be entering greater and greater degrees of relaxation, natural stillness, and at the same time, vigilance that allows us to stay awake, to continue practicing, even though we are hopefully becoming more and more relaxed. Our speech is resting in a state of natural silence, since we're not using it, and since our breath is moving naturally, without any attempts to control it, to force it, to hold it. And as for our mind, because it is observing the sensations in the present moment, it is also going more and more deeply into a state of relaxation, stability, and clarity. Clarity of awareness, of cognition, of knowing. Then, for the second half of settling our body, speech, and mind, and this part of instructions comes from a slightly different lineage, still associated with Padmasambhava, we revisit our motivation for being here today. And first we just check, what brought me personally to this exploration, to this discussion, to these ideas, to this class, to Tibet House in general? What are my personal aspirations, wishes, desires, goals, with regards to this material, or just my contemplative life in general? So we spend a few moments exploring that. And then it is important to expand on that, to build on that, by making our aspirations more vast and more profound, where the quality of profundity means that we're aspiring for the deepest possible level of happiness, well-being, and satisfaction, not simply different types of hedonic pleasures, different types of worldly success, and so forth, even though all of that is important. But not just that. The deepest level of happiness that comes from knowing the true nature of reality, from having a profoundly balanced mind, from leading a profoundly ethical way of life. And the quality of vastness comes through wishing for that great degree of happiness and well-being to be available to all, not just to ourselves. And so the fusion of those is the so-called conventional or relative bodhicitta, which is the wish for us to fully wake up to our greatest potential in order to bring the greatest possible happiness and freedom to all beings. So for a few moments, if that motivation does make some sense to us, we can breathe life into this type of resolve and strengthen it in our minds so that it becomes a powerful foundation for the ensuing discussion. May every moment of the time we spend together contribute to that great awakening for the benefit of all. And if we do find a certain connection to White Tara in particular, may we always have a direct connection to her as a window leading to that great awakening. We then return to our body, just to notice the experiences there, the process of breathing, the tactile sensations, the current state of the body. And then, when it's comfortable, we slowly introduce a little bit of movement to the body by perhaps rocking back and forth a tiny bit, smiling, moving our hands and fingers, and slowly and gradually concluding the preliminary meditation practice. Thank you. So, just to restate what I said previously, even this meditation, even though it can be described as a relaxation exercise, and that would be totally valid, we don't need to make things excessively mystical or mysterious or esoteric, even though it is seemingly relaxation exercise, which it is for sure. This is also a deeply profound practice that comes from a specific lineage, actually from multiple lineages. There's a version of this practice that comes from Padmasambhava through some great contemplatives of multiple different centuries. In fact, some of them in the 14th century, some of them in the 19th century, and so forth. And there's a very similar practice that comes through a different lineage of transmission within Tibetan culture, and namely through the Bumpo transmission lineage, now represented by such living masters as Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche and many others. And although the nature of this practice would be described in a very similar manner in both of these lineages, by looking at the specific method through the lens of lineage transmission, by seeing the inspiration behind this practice, seeing the logic behind this practice, and seeing how it can be applied on multiple levels of our spiritual path, not just as a preliminary exercise, we develop a deep state of appreciation, and that appreciation inspires us to continue using this practice to gain the multiple benefits associated with it. And then as we gain those benefits, we become more and more convinced of its efficiency. And because this practice is actually sometimes described as the entirety of the path, in that it can be a preliminary exercise, but it can also be a practice for gaining the true insight, the deepest type of insight into the true nature of reality, there goes our enlightenment. We've mastered it all through just doing this profound practice on multiple levels, in many different ways, adjusting it here and there a little bit, and eventually becoming enlightened. So that's the end of it. Thank you for coming. That would be sufficient in a way. We could even limit ourselves to this. That's not our primary practice for today. We will instead talk about White Tara, but even this tiny bit, which is actually quite important for then practicing White Tara, is a good indication of how these things work. Each specific component can contain the entirety of it all, but would only be inspiring when we can truly place it into its original context. Were we to take the practice completely out of this original context, were we to simply go through the outer movements of it, but completely ignore all the teachings around that, it would indeed appear to us as simply a relaxation exercise. And it would only bring us the benefits associated with relaxation exercises, which are still very considerable in this day and age. Who doesn't need relaxation? I know I do. But beyond that, there's so much more that we can gain. Pretty similar with White Tara practice. So I'll be showing some slides as usual, and I apologize in advance for probably multiple misprints that have crept in. I don't know how, don't know whom to blame, but you'll see some, so feel free to laugh at them and, poke me and say, haha, there goes one again, as long as we get the overall meaning. And in the discussion of this overall meaning, I always adopt the one and only mental position that I think would be appropriate for someone like me to be sharing this material. I'm certainly not a capital T teacher, not a lama, not a guru, not a lineage holder of any kind, not a practitioner who would have any knowledge or experience or understanding or qualities. And so the only way to deliver this material is to imagine that I'm the worst student in class and I have been tasked, this time by Beata and the wonderful team at Tibet House US, to prepare a little presentation for the rest of the class. The rest of the class are mostly A grade students. They're brilliant and they know so much more than I do, but because the material itself is valid and hopefully the slides are not too confusing or too bad, we will still get benefit from going through this revision process. But at the end or towards the end of the class, and also in the things that we will send out after this presentation, there will be some pointers as to where exactly can you go to continue your exploration of Vaitara practice, which masters can you in this day and age connect to if you want to receive the appropriate Vaitara transmissions, empowerments, and so forth. We did have that as one of the questions before this session. Someone asked whether I would be giving a Vaitara transmission, and I had to giggle at that because no, we will talk about the level of Vaitara practice that can be used even if you don't have any transmissions at all. There is that level. We will discuss it at length. But beyond that, I will certainly share some ideas about the living great lineage holders, female and male, who can be approached to receive these transmissions so that you can explore the totality and the fullness of Vaitara practice. And the beauty of our very problematic times, one specific aspect that arose partly out of the pandemic is that we can now receive some of these transmissions even online. And so that means we don't necessarily have to travel thousands of miles in order to get these teachings like our dharmic ancestors did in the past. Vaitara practice came to Tibet because there was a number of incredibly brave, courageous, and dedicated translators who went across the Himalayan range to India, suffered from the horrific, for Tibetans, heat, from a very different system of bacteria and all of that, suffered horribly. Many of them died pretty horrible deaths, actually, but some of them were able to come back and bring these teachings back to Tibet. And some of those teachings included the elements that we're now using in Vaitara practice. And to bow to the incredible Dharma ancestries that we have here, this very first photograph here is a photo I took quite recently in Swayambhunath in Nepal. Some people would know that Swayambhunath is one of the most important Dharma locations in Nepal. So if you ever find yourself in Nepal, Swayambhunath would be the great stupa of Swayambhunath, which is actually a whole hill, not just the little temple, a few temples on the top of it, but the entire hill is celebrated as an incredible space of Dharma practice. Along this trajectory where you walk around the hill, you would find many deities, and Vaitara would be a recurring deity there as well. You would see many statues, many images, many depictions of her mantra, and so forth. So that shows us something about the importance and the popularity of this practice. So what's the purpose? Why do we do this? What's the idea? Is it simply a practice that is, as one of the living masters of this day and age, Khandra Rinpoche of the Mindriling lineage, is it simply a mental Disneyland, as she refers to it? Because Vaitara practice is a practice in which we visualize something. There's Vaitara herself, and there's light radiating somewhere. We imagine offerings and beautiful flowers and all that kind of thing. And then we imagine ourselves in a pure land. And then we recite some mantras, and there's more visualizations used along with that. So is it just mental Disneyland in the same way that back in the 70s, there was a great degree of popularity around the practices for visualize yourself in your happy space. Is that a similar kind of thing? Or, for example, visualizing yourself becoming successful. Yeah, at the moment, I don't have that much material success, but if I keep visualizing hundreds of dollars right there in my hands, maybe one day I will manifest it. Is it this kind of thing? Is it what it's used for? These kinds of things and exercises and ideas? Well, no. When we look at the traditional context for it, the traditional context within which this practice would be transmitted, we would always see only one description of the purpose for studying this practice. And when talking about this, I'm not at all saying in a didactic manner that this is something that we should all subscribe to right now. No, some of us are here in this session just to look at it all and see whether it makes any sense. So I'm not saying this is what we need to adopt immediately. But if you were to go to a white Tara empowerment with a proper lineage holder within the Indo-Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, and indeed, if you do one day go to such an empowerment, such a transmission, where you would also get the teachings on this practice and so forth, the system of practice would always begin with the master, with the preceding master, preceding lama, explaining this specific purpose and saying that's the only appropriate motivation for receiving these teachings and then practicing them. So it says here on the slide, the practice of White Tara, along with most other meditational deities in the Vajrayana tradition, is used to realize the so-called supreme and common attainments, or siddhi in Sanskrit. So siddhi would be a concept that is familiar to scholars and practitioners of Indic lineages in general. If you're practicing yoga, you probably would have heard about siddhi, and you would probably have heard about siddhas. Siddhas are those who have realized siddhi. So people who have, or beings who have siddhi, or these attainments, are called siddhas. And if they have them to a great degree, then they are called mahasiddhas, the great perfect ones, the great realized ones, the greatly attained ones. So the siddhis are spiritual attainments that are divided in the Buddhist approach, and sometimes that's also used in other Indic lineages, into the common and the supreme. The supreme attainment is just full enlightenment, full awakening, fully waking up to our true nature, to the true nature of reality, and becoming a fully awakened Buddha, just like Prince Siddhartha Gautama did back in the day, 2,500 years ago, where he embarked on his spiritual journey, explored some stuff, tried out certain exercises in asceticism, in single point and concentration and so forth, and eventually arrived at his own unique blend of methods, which in particular unite two very important aspects of practice. The single-pointed concentration attained by means of concentration practices known as shamatha in Sanskrit, tamatha in Pali, and insight practices, exploring the true nature of the self, the true nature of reality, the true nature of phenomena by means of insight techniques known as vipassana in Sanskrit, vipassana in Pali. And in blending the two, combining a certain degree of single-pointed concentration achieved through shamatha and a certain degree of insight attained through vipassana, the Buddha achieved the supreme siddhi of awakening. Since that's the very heart of the Buddhist tradition, both shamatha and vipassana are also present and used in White Tara practice as well. Even though White Tara practice is full of things like mantras and visualizations and so forth, shamatha and vipassana, samatha and vipassana, or shamatha and vipassana are built into White Tara as a system of practice and are absolutely quintessential for eventually realizing this practice. However, along the way to this so-called supreme attainment of full awakening, which is the highest goal we can aspire for, full awakening for the benefit of all sentient beings, right? We might find certain common or worldly or mundane attainments to be helpful as well. And these are the so-called common siddhi. We would have different lists of these common siddhi in different systems. People who have studied classical yoga as described in, for example, Hatha Yoga Pradipika and other Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and so forth, would know that there is a list of common siddhis which include the ability to make your body bigger, the ability to make your body smaller, the ability to manifest material things and so forth. There's that traditional list that is quite frequently quoted in the Indian tradition in general. But the Buddhist Vajrayana tradition expands on that a little bit and just says that there are multiple types of common attainments, and one of them would be, for example, longevity. Why? Well, longevity is quite an attainment, right? If we manifest longevity where originally there was none. We were, for example, not particularly healthy. We were not meant to live long in terms of our unique karmic circumstances, but we used a specific practice. We changed the interdependence of things and we attained a certain degree of longevity. That's an attainment. That's seen as an attainment. Or material prosperity. So there are some deity practices which are focused more closely on rehashing our current interdependence in a way where we would be able to enjoy a certain level of material abundance, and not necessarily just for ourselves. For example, Tsongkhapa was the great lineage originator of the Gelugpa tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, and one of the greatest yogis and scholars in Tibetan history, seen by his followers then and by representatives of other lineages as well as an emanation of the Buddha of wisdom, Manjushri. Tsongkhapa used an abundance deity practice at one point to raise the funds or to create the interdependence for raising the funds for his first monastery. And he did not see it as beneath himself, even though he was an incredibly learned yogi, an incredibly proper monastic and so forth. No, he just saw it as means to a goal. We need some money to build this monastery, to establish the center of practice and study. So let's do this practice, attain this common gain, realize this common attainment of prosperity, and then use it for something beneficial. So that's the category in which these common attainments would ideally be perceived. We're not practicing these methods just to gain the ability to live long or read others' minds, or indeed, manifest in two places at the same time, or the ability to never sleep, which at least two of my teachers displayed. Both of them have passed away since then, but they had that ability. I've met masters who had incredible ability to read minds with a certain degree of clarity. I've met masters who were able to make very accurate predictions with regards to the future and so forth. These are all common attainments, certain degrees of clarity with regards to what's going on, and certain ability to affect what's going on in terms of either our own body, speech, and mind, or what's going on around us, the ability to affect the overall interdependence of things. These are the common attainments. But when we're using a practice such as Vaitara or really any other Vajrayana method, we would be invited to only pursue common attainments as instrumental goals, whereas the supreme attainment, the supreme siddhi of awakening, is the ultimate goal. So there's that very helpful division, which has nothing to do in particular with Buddhism. It's just a helpful idea in general. Dividing our goals into the instrumental ones and the ultimate ones. The ultimate goal might be world peace, or anything else of that nature, preserving the planet Earth as we know it, and so forth. The instrumental goals are the goals we want to attain along that trajectory. If we confuse the instrumental goals and the ultimate goal, something will go wrong, quite likely, because we have created a cargo cult around something that in itself is not necessarily that valuable. So longevity itself is only valuable when we're using it for wisdom, for compassion, to be generous, to be kind, to attain full awakening, to affect the overall interdependence of things in positive ways. Otherwise, why live long? And actually in Vaitara teachings, because they have to do with longevity quite a lot, it is sometimes said, well, these methods should only be used by people who are actually doing something meaningful with their lives. And in particular, by people who are bringing greater degrees of wisdom and compassion to their existence and to the existence of others. And these methods should not be used to prolong the lives of those who are actively harming others by, for example, waging wars and destroying the ecosphere and robbing people or cheating people and so forth. That's not the kind of person that is a suitable vessel for Vaitara practices. So that's the overall idea there. However, it is quite important to also say that while we're practicing Vaitara methods along the path to full awakening and maybe to these attainments of longevity, prosperity, and so forth, we would hopefully also be seeing some positive change happening within us, in that we're becoming more calm, more kind, more compassionate, more wise, more attuned to the interdependence of things, more mindful of our ethical behavior, and so forth. So indeed, it would be valid for people to say, what's the point of your Vaitara practice or any kind of spiritual practice that you might be undertaking if it's not making you a better person? And sometimes people would ask that question in a manipulative way, because within their worldview, being a better person means that we need to necessarily follow along with their demands or subscribe to their manipulative desires and so forth. So that's not the idea here. But in general, truly becoming more kind, more patient, more generous, more ethical, and so forth, that's the overall idea here. So that's something for us to keep in mind in the long run when we're doing these practices. Because if we have been practicing Vaitara for a few years and then we're not really becoming a better person, we're not becoming more empathetic, compassionate, and so forth, there's something that went wrong, and then we need to go back to the structure of our practice and adjust it accordingly. That would be the invitation here. So when we're doing these practices in their full version, and the full version of Vaitara practice would entail receiving a certain number of transmissions, I will later describe them and make a list and present a list of what those transmissions would ideally be for the fully fledged practice. Not the preliminary version that we're going to do today together, that's available to everyone, but the full in-depth practice that would lead to full awakening. In order to get that, we would also be told that even for the process of transmission to properly occur, we need to have at least 3 quintessential qualifications. We need to have the qualification that implies or entails these 3 very important qualities. The Tsongkhapa, whom I've already mentioned today, brought them into a quintessential list of 3 that is now known colloquially in the Indo-Tibetan tradition as the 3 principal aspects of the path, Lamtso Namsum in Tibetan. Some other traditions would present the same points by using a slightly different numbered lists. And once again, the same joke about how Christians love God and Buddhists love numbered lists always holds true. Here's another number list for you. You might not have been expecting. How to spell that is a question in the chat. You just need to spell the 3 principal aspects of the path. If you Google that, you would find a profusion of materials on this specific teaching, including some books by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, teachings by such modern day thinkers like Professor Bob Thurman and his friend Alex Berzin and many others, numerous Tibetan teachers, Mongolian teachers. There would be a great profusion of materials if you just look for the 3 principal aspects of the path. These 3 principal aspects of the path are usually translated as renunciation, conventional bodhicitta, and wisdom, understanding, emptiness. So the idea would be that we have already undertaken a certain degree of training in these basic mental states. We have done a certain number of meditations. We have accumulated actually multiple hours of meditation that would lead to having some degree of renunciation, having some degree of conventional bodhicitta, and having some degree of wisdom, understanding, emptiness. And with that functional level of these 3 qualities, when we attend a transmission ceremony, so-called empowerment or multiple empowerments, that would be even better, the actual process of transmission would take hold. It would actually happen, something it would get transmitted. Because if we simply show up at a transmission ceremony and we are not engaged in it, and also we don't have the necessary preparation that was undertaken before that, something would still happen to a certain degree, but that it would not be as powerful as it might have been. And the benefit that we would receive from such a transmission would be strongly diminished compared to the full benefit that might be received by indeed investing the hours of training into these preliminary states. So just to bring a little bit of clarity on these, what do these refer to? Because word renunciation is, of course, a tricky one. Conventional bodhicitta sounds a bit tricky as well. And then wisdom, understanding, emptiness might sound clear, but then actually not be clear at all. So a very preliminary discussion of this. These are all absolutely vital for white Tara practice and for any type of Tara practice, just for clarity. It's not like, oh, so white Tara is quite demanding. She wants me to have renunciation. I'll just go to the green Tara. She might not have these demands. You know, it's not like that at all. No, they all want, all the meditational deities would want us to have these, because all the meditational deities are the symbolic embodiments of these qualities in their fullness. White Tara, green Tara, Avalokiteshvara, Medicine Buddha, Guru Rinpoche, Amitabha, the Buddha of infinite light, Manjushri, the Buddha of wisdom, wrathful deities such as Yamantaka or Vajrakilaya, and so forth. All of these figures that we see in Tibetan tankas with their multiple arms and different implements and bodies of different colors, different gender expressions, different ages, and so forth. All of them are symbolically embodying these three qualities, and then the awakening that is the fusion of these three qualities. So renunciation is not at all giving up on sensory pleasures necessarily. It's not at all about going into a monastery, because you can be in a monastery and not at all have renunciation. It's not about going into a cave either, because you can be a king and have a profound sense of renunciation. And that's why some of the great Mahasiddhas of ancient India were indeed kings or queens, princesses, princes, and so forth. And some of them were indeed cave practitioners also, or blacksmiths, or arrow makers, or musicians. So you can practice renunciation in any walk of life, but the idea is that renunciation is a form of self-compassion that inspires us to look for the sustainable type of happiness instead of the more fleeting one. Renunciation is basically a state of mind that understands the limitations of the merely hedonic types of pleasure, happiness, and well-being. And because it does understand those limitations, it inspires us to look for the greater degree of happiness that comes from within. And so the foundational level of renunciation would inspire us to at least look for a good rebirth or a cycle of good rebirths in samsara. And then ultimately, it would inspire us to try to go beyond samsara altogether. We would be inspired to try to liberate our body, speech, and mind from the bondage that is currently in place, the bondage of our own limiting mental states, our own ignorance, and so forth. So the wish to break free, to quote Freddie Mercury, the wish to break free from this state of bondage in which we're currently finding ourselves is indeed what renunciation is. And there are multiple levels of it, but the total and final degree of it is this fully powerful, passionate wish to liberate ourselves from the bondage of ignorance in particular. Then conventional bodhicitta is a fusion of compassion, loving kindness, and wisdom that inspires us to wish to become a fully awakened Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings. We meditated on that aspiration in the beginning of this class. The only difference here is that for us to actually possess it on a stable basis, it would not be simply a passing thought that we generated in a specific meditation. It would be a stable mental state, sometimes even described as one of the primary states of consciousness, along with visual consciousness and so forth. So it's become so deeply embedded within us that it becomes as powerfully present within us as our ability to perceive visual forms or hear sounds and so forth. That's one of the descriptions there. And it comes through, it becomes so powerful because we meditate on such things as love and compassion. We invest many hours of training into love, compassion, and so forth. And then we increase their intensity by following a specific sequence of meditations until we gain this very powerful and very stable state of conventional bodhicitta, which is the constantly present wish to become fully awakened for the benefit of all sentient beings. So the ultimate form of altruism in a way, conventional form of altruism, conceptual form of altruism. But the counterpart to that is the third aspect, wisdom, understanding, emptiness, that's sometimes known as ultimate bodhicitta. And that is indeed wisdom. And wisdom can be defined. I like to quote Sylvia Burstein here, whom some of you would know from her teachings at Spirit Rock and her wonderful books, mostly in the Theravada tradition, actually. She has this wonderful definition that is extremely true throughout all the different branches of the Buddhist tradition. Wisdom is an exceptional level of common sense, an exceptional level of common sense. What is it? What is it about? What is it? Common sense with regards to what is the question here? Well, there are two primary aspects of wisdom. One is wisdom with regards to the relative phenomena that we see around us, the conventional phenomena. That includes things like causes and conditions, social relationships, ecological dynamics, and so forth. All of that, our social intelligence, our ecological intelligence, our emotional intelligence. These are all different facets of that conventional wisdom. And then another kind of wisdom that comes through by understanding, how do phenomena actually exist? What's their ontological status? Does a person really exist as a fixed, solitary, unchanging entity? Do all phenomena truly exist from their own side, or are they merely conventional labels projected by our consciousness and put on a suitable basis, and sometimes on an unsuitable basis when we misperceive something, but we then become truly convinced in it, That's the exploration there. And eventually, through doing many types of meditation and analysis, and indeed some study there as well, that's why to gain this wisdom of understanding emptiness, some people would spend 20 years studying the great philosophical treatises on the Indo-Tibetan tradition, and other traditions as well. And some people would gain that by relying more on the so-called pith instructions, where there's just a little bit of pointing towards proper type of meditation that we need to do, and we still arrive at the same conclusion. And finally, for the extremely rare individuals, there's sometimes a possibility of gaining that wisdom simply through a transmission of blessings. So one of my primary teachers, once again, Chicken Rinpoche, sometimes says that there's three primary approaches to gaining that wisdom. One is the approach of study and debate, and that's where we actually study the philosophical treatises and we meditate on them. Then there's the approach of pith instructions, which is get quintessential pointers that take us along the stages of this training. And finally, there's the extremely rare and powerful approach of the transmission of blessings, where you might be knocked on the head with a sandal, or you might be shown merely a symbol of something, or the master might just direct their attention towards your mind, and suddenly you gain the understanding. That's also possible, but it's extremely rare. So it's better not to count on that last one really happening. It's better to practice as if we were mostly focusing on the first two, combining them skillfully. And then if the third one does indeed happen along the way, because we are one of these extremely rare individuals, the better. It would be such a celebration when that happens, but not to still make use of them by indeed doing some study, doing some practice, and doing a lot of meditation on how does it all actually exist. So when we have invested all of these hours into renunciation, conventional bodhicitta, and wisdom, understanding, emptiness, the fusion of that would be present within our mind as a stable basis for anything else would make us a proper vessel for white Tara practice, or green Tara practice, or red Tara practice, yellow Tara practice, blue Tara practice. There's billions of Taras actually, certainly multiple hundreds of different Taras described in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, but each one of them would be sufficient for progressing towards the common and supreme attainments. Because each Tara would be sufficient, sometimes such practices as white Tara practice are described as one practice that encompasses all. In the Kagyu tradition, especially in the Kamtsang Kagyu, Karma Kagyu, there's a wonderful Tibetan expression of Chikshe Kundro, seeing one liberates everything. And there's sometimes cycles of empowerments and transmissions which are built along this logic. Is a path in itself. So you would get an empowerment for white Tara, for white Manjushri, for yellow Manjushri, for green Tara, for Amita. You would get dozens of different empowerments, but then you would be told, well, just practice one of them, really. Choose one that suits you, that you feel a connection to. And through practicing that, you will gain all the common and supreme attainments, because you put everything into just this one container. Even though we're told not to put all of our eggs in one basket, it's exactly what is the invitation here. We can put all the eggs of different aspects of practice into one basket that is, for example, the basket of white Tara. So that's the logic that we're going to explore today, even though in some traditions, white Tara is described as merely a supportive practice, a practice that would provide certain degrees of support, while our main emphasis would be on something else, on a method that is more complex, that involves a meditational deity with more arms, more heads, more colors, maybe in union with the concert and so forth. It is indeed, and I'm not making this myself, I've heard this from multiple lamas, sufficient to just practice one thing, such as white Tara, but to practice it really passionately, skillfully, and appropriately, and it would lead us to all the wonderful results that we might be going for, including the common and uncommon attainments. So this is where, actually, when we are receiving white Tara empowerment or any other empowerment, any other Vajrayana empowerment, within the empowerment ceremony, there would always be a special moment in which the presiding master, with the help of their interpreter or translator quite often, would read out or orally narrate this history of a specific practice and of a specific transmission. So before the transmission is given, its authenticity is established by reading out the history of how this practice came to be, who transmitted it, who discovered it, who practiced it, how was it then codified and written down for this specific lineage, for this specific empowerment ceremony, and so forth. And through hearing that, the students are invited to activate a specific mental factor or a specific mental function that is known as faith. And faith in Buddhist psychology is described as a very specific mental state, a psychological state that ideally would not be blind faith at all, but would rely on valid conviction in the efficiency and the inner logic of the method at hand. But nonetheless, it would be an invitation to awaken a certain degree of conviction or faith with regards to a specific practice. So when Tara practices as described, instead of simply saying, oh, this is how this specific empowerment or this specific practice came to be, we're sometimes first introduced to Tara herself. So essentially, who's this lady, right? And why is she floating in the sky in front of me, either in her white form or green form or red form? She has dozens of forms or hundreds of forms, but why is she there in the first place? What's the history behind this form? So this is where there would be 3 levels of description potentially available to us. And even if you're not interested in doing these meditations or practices as part of your spiritual path, when you visit, for example, Tibet, murals that are currently on display, right? You see the images, little postcard with white Tara or green Tara or any other kind of Tara on it. This would be the association system that would come to mind if you're familiar with it. So there's 3 aspects here: the transhistorical aspect, the individual aspect, and the universal aspect. 3 different ways of looking at Tara in general. So the transhistorical aspect, and the term transhistorical is used here because it's not within our written history. It's a history beyond history. It's sort of like Star Wars. In a galaxy far, far away, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. That's literally what it says about the history of who Tara is, because Tara is described as having arisen in a different cosmic age, in a different universe, because Buddhism describes multiple universes, myriads of universes coexisting, but coexisting in a way where one universe is currently going through the stage of dissolution, another universe is still arising, and the third universe is currently inhabitable and indeed inhabited. And so there's trillions of universes all over the place doing this kind of thing. And in one of them, essentially a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, there was a princess called, in our understanding, Jnana Chandra, or Yeshidawa in Tibetan. And that princess, and her story is very often narrated when talking about Tara, is the princess that eventually did become Tara. Tara is her realized name, her enlightened name, her name as an enlightened or awakened being. Prajna Chandra is her passport name, in the same way that I have a passport name in my passport, and then I have Michael Lobsang Tenpa as my professional name, partly reliant on my monastic name, which was Lobsang Tenpa. So in the similar way, she has multiple identities and names. But the thing about this princess was that she was a very dedicated, very focused, very strong practitioner. But as it happens, she was surrounded by men that were quite chauvinistic. I don't want to say they were pigs, but essentially that's the idea there. And they told her, oh, you're such a good practitioner, quite uncharacteristically for a woman. You should really pray to be reborn as a man, and then you'll be able to finally enter the gates of full awakening. Wouldn't that be lovely? And she essentially gave them the finger and said, no, I'm not doing that. I will instead attain full awakening in a female form. And indeed, that's my vow. I will keep manifesting in female forms and showing that enlightenment, full enlightenment and in a female form is definitely possible. The background against which this story arose in ancient India involved some debates around that, because in some sources related to Buddhism, you would see an indication that, yes, indeed, to fully push for final awakening and to manifest finally awakened, as a fully awakened Buddha, you do need in that last lifetime to manifest in a male form, which, okay, sure, Jan, and then you would have sources that say, oh no, this is not at all necessary. You can manifest enlightenment in any form you want. And indeed, Guru Rinpoche, or Padmasambhava, whose relaxation technique we apply today, on one occasion said to one of his female students, and he had trained a group of exceptionally gifted 5 yoginis in particular, one of whom we will also reference later today. When talking to one of his great female students, he said, actually, Yeshitsogel, that was the name of that specific yogini. In terms of gaining an awakening, female form is superior to a male form. It is more suitable for attaining awakening due to the unique configuration of energy channels and so forth. Female form is superior for the higher yogas. So there you go. So there was that debate, essentially, and it was motivated by multiple factors. It is actually important to admit that one of the major factors is that male monastics don't like sharing offerings with female monastics. That's still happening to this day. It's a big problem in some Asian countries. That's a big problem in the West. Male monasteries receive more financial support than nunneries. So there's like the same thing all over the place. So Jnana Chandra's promise was very important back then in a different galaxy, and it's still very important in this day and age. We haven't moved, we haven't seen much progress in terms of gender equality, neither in these 2000 years of written history in which Tara practice has been around, nor maybe in these cosmic ages that are described, eras that are described here. Whatever is the case, Jnana Chandra gave that promise, and indeed then became enlightened as Tara, as a female Buddha who manifests in multiple forms. Another story talks about how Tara, along the path to awakening, was practicing under the guidance of a Buddha, a transhistoric Buddha named Amoghasiddhi. So Amoghasiddhi is, within the Tibetan visual system, sometimes depicted as a green Buddha. He's green in color because he represents this wisdom of attaining the goals, the all-attaining wisdom, all-realizing, all-accomplishing wisdom. And for that reason, the most popular of Taras, green Tara, has the same color. Sometimes they're described as cosmic partners. Sometimes they're even depicted as being in union. But the symbolism of this story specifically is that Tara represents the ability to get things done, to accomplish stuff, to cut through our fears, through indecisiveness and so forth, and to indeed manifest something along the way. Then the next one is the third story, which is also symbolic in nature, and that's the story of how Tara or two Taras manifested out of Avalokiteshvara's tear. Essentially very simple and a story that is quite easy to interpret. Avalokiteshvara is the Buddha or the Bodhisattva of compassion. In some sources, he's described as a Bodhisattva. In some time, I should say, because Kuan Yin and one of the expressions of Avalokiteshvara is definitely female. So in some sources, Avalokiteshvara manifests as a Bodhisattva, and some they are described as a Buddha. So both would be true. However, in that specific story, Avalokiteshvara is a Bodhisattva trying to accomplish the benefit of all beings, seeing that it's kind of a very difficult cause to commit to, because the beings are being very naughty. They're not at all jumping into the ship of enlightenment. They're still causing problems for themselves and others. So Avalokiteshvara, seeing that, they shed tears, a couple of tears, and those tears transform into Tara. In some versions of this story, one tear became Tara, and the other tear became a form of Tara known as Brikuti. In some other stories, more recent in nature, you would have them transform into green Tara and white Tara. That's a natural evolution. Brikuti is a relatively obscure deity in this day and age, even though she was quite important originally. And white Tara and green Tara are the most popular forms of Tara in this day and age in the modern Tibetan tradition. So that's how they kind of supplanted Brikuti in this role. But the idea is that it's not enough to just have compassion, and Avalokiteshvara is an embodiment of compassion. You need that active element, the pushy element, the element that gets things done. And that's what white Tara and green Tara represent in different ways. So that's the third transhistoric element of that story. Is it possible that Avalokiteshvara indeed did shed some tears at one point? Absolutely. I mean, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is never shy about crying. He weeps quite often when hearing stories that are making his compassion go into an even more active mode. He weeps when he remembers his mother. Sometimes he weeps when he thinks about what happened to Tibet. He sometimes cries when people talk to him about the suffering of their parents, or someone being sick. So it is totally possible for Avalokiteshvara to cry. But then what happened was that those tears became a powerful incentive for action. So that's what Tara represents. And how to spell the one he just mentioned? I'm guessing you're asking about Brikuti. I just spelled it in the chat, but that's not important for our current discussion. We're focusing on Tara, and she was definitely coming out of one of those tears. Then we can see Tara as a universal force, or the universal force field, or the universal aspect of reality. And then so for that reason, in some texts on Tara, including modern day texts, and we will include a number of books on Tara that you can peruse in your spare time in English. In some of those, Tara is described as ultimately being Prajna Paramita, so the perfection of wisdom, or the wisdom that goes beyond, or as Samantabhadri, which means the universally good in a female form, the universal goodness. Kuntusangmo in Tibetan, which would mean the universally good mother, or lady. Prajna Paramita, Samantabhadri, and there are some others, are just these cosmic symbols for the ultimate nature of reality, the ultimate wisdom that knows the nature of reality, ultimate goodness in indeed female form. So you would sometimes have them depicted visually. You would have visual depictions of Prajna Paramita in her various forms, sometimes with 4 arms, sometimes with 2 arms. You would have statues of Prajna Paramita. You would have tankas of Prajna Paramita. And of course, Prajna Paramita is also the name for a system of texts that describe the process of gaining that ultimate wisdom of the nature of reality. Many of those texts have been translated into English now, specifically through the wonderful 84,000 project, and many are on their way. So soon enough, we'll be able to sit under the Bodhi tree, or sit in front of the capital and recite the Prajna Paramita verses, therefore making that ultimate nature of reality come through as a sound, in the form of a sound that all beings can hear. The same with Samantabhadri. There are some prayers and chants and mantras and hymns that her as the ultimate form of sound. But the idea there is that either Prajnaparamita or Samantabhadri, they manifest in different forms to guide beings, to help beings, to guide beings towards full awakening, and all therefore female awakened forms, and that includes living masters, great female lamas that are with us in this day and age, including Khandrula, Khandra Tserengma, who also taught at Tibet House, literally just a couple of weeks ago. She is by some people perceived, by some great masters, including His Holiness, described as an embodiment of Tara or expression of Tara, as an embodiment of Prajnaparamita. And she's also described as a yogini who has an exceptional level of understanding of Prajnaparamita, or the perfection of wisdom. So in that regard, being the wisdom itself, inseparable from compassion, Tara is then described as the mother of all Buddhas, of all Bodhisattvas, of arhats, and so forth. So moving on to the individual. Oh, yes. So because she manifests in these different forms, here's a quote from two wonderful masters who have taught in the United States for decades. Khenpo brothers, as they're known. Khenpo Palden Sherap, who is no longer with us, he passed away some years ago, more than 10 years ago, actually. And Khenpo Tsewang Dongyal, his brother, he's very much still alive and teaching in the Padmasambhava Center in the United States. They have many wonderful books, including some books on Tara. And so from their Tara book, among all these emanations, it is sufficient for us to practice just one. Green Tara, white Tara, red Tara. Yeshe Tsogyal is that female student of Guru Rinpoche that he was addressing when he said that the female body is superior to male body. Or Vajrasarasvati, so the enlightened embodiment of music, enlightened speech, eloquence, and so forth. Any of these practices can remove our fears, obscurations, and obstacles, help us develop the ability to benefit all beings, and assist us to reach enlightenment. So essentially, whichever form, whichever of these female forms we choose, it doesn't have to be a female form really, but why not? Any of these forms would lead us along the way. So we're now zoning in on white Tara, slowly starting with this more universal level. And then finally, before we take our bio break, the individual level of Tara. This is seeing Tara, any form of Tara, but let's say white Tara, as an expression of our own awakened nature, of our own future awakening, and of the path that would take us to that future awakening. So we look at the picture of white Tara, let's say we have a postcard with white Tara, and we look at that and we're not thinking about a princess that used to live in another day and age. We're not thinking about this cosmic mother that represents the ultimate nature of reality. We're thinking, no, this is a form that will allow me to become awakened. This is an expression of my own future awakening. And this is a symbolic expression of my own Buddha nature, my basic goodness. And that's enough. So some people find inspiration in these transhistorical aspects of Tara's story. Some find great inspiration in thinking about Tara as a universal aspect of reality. Some find inspiration in focusing on the individual level. And in the long run, we need all three. We combine the three, and we can focus on one of the three when it feels most appropriate. So sometimes it is indeed so vital to focus on white Tara or green Tara or any other Tara as our own potential, a symbol of our own potential in a graphic form. Sometimes it is so vital to focus on how Tara pervades the whole nature of reality. She is at the heart of all beings. She's at the heart of all phenomena. She is the underlying nature of reality. We need to just tap into that. And sometimes, very important to think, well, indeed, she was that princess who gave the finger to those chauvinistic males. And she did become awakened. And she now still to this day and age manifesting in these various forms to guide us and to protect us. And I also can connect to that as well. So all three can be possible. And with regards to this individual level, and that's where the practices come in, we can see white Tara as a container or a basket indeed. It is a container in that to properly do white Tara practice, we would be collecting individual elements, some concentration, some insight, some compassion, some loving kindness, some refuge, some understanding of karma, practiced individually originally. But we would put them all together into this container so that they can be grown properly, stimulated properly, our basic understanding of karma, our basic understanding of the nature of reality, our degree of concentration, whatever it is that available to us right now, our ethical practice, Shila, right? Our practice of ethical values and restraints and precepts and so forth. And then our ability to imagine stuff. We put that all into that container, and within that container, they all get incubated. That's one way to see Vajrayana practice. Vajrayana practice is a way to weave together. That's what Tantra literally means, a weave. That's one of the ways of translating the original term. We weave all these different components together to attain the result faster. Because if we were practicing all of those things individually, which we still need to do to a certain degree, it would take a very long time to gain the ultimate result, the ultimate siddhi of full awakening. Then another way of looking at Tara is seeing her as a window. I imagine Tara in front of me. That's what we're going to do in meditation later today. And through Tara as a window, I'm looking into my own ultimate qualities of compassion, wisdom, and so forth. A window that opens things up for me, brings me into contact with the nature of reality. And I should say that that's not, once again, a concept that is unique to Buddhism. I was yesterday revisiting some poetry by Thomas Merton, who's one of my intellectual heroes, and of course, a very Buddhist adjacent person who was right on the verge of studying Padmasambhava's lineage of practice when he tragically died in Bangkok. Well, probably still studying it in his next life, or in the pure realms. And so he has poems describing Mary as a window, not as an individual, but as a window into the ultimate reality. And that comes very close to what we're talking about here now. And a final consideration is to see Tara as a stencil or a mold, because in some practices we are quite actively taking the energy of our body, taking the energy of our speech so that they become Tara. And so through that, we then can graduate into full awakening. So that's another way of looking at these practices. And all three approaches are valid, important, and necessary to gain some benefit from Tara practice. So I suggest we take a 10-minute bio break right now. And when we come back, we will talk about the actual lineage of Tara transmission, some of the male and female masters in that lineage, and then some of the elements of this practice that we can start applying right here now if we want to. So hopefully with that, we'll see each other in 10 minutes. Thank you, and enjoy your tiny break. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice break. And if not, we'll be done soon. So hopefully the rest of you, Saturday will be lovely. Yeah, let's have some fun by discussing the history of White Tara practice. What could be more exciting? And as you can see, I am weirdly excited by it. So I'll hope some of my enthusiasm will be infectious in a positive way. And if not, as always, just eat fruit, to quote Chikane Rinpoche once again. So the specific White Tara practice that is quite commonly done in the Indo-Tibetan tradition is known as the practice of the wish-fulfilling will, or a Chinta Chakra Tara. Tara, who is a wish-fulfilling will. The name wish-fulfilling will is not random. It's not a random praise for Tara because she's like a wheel of activity that fulfills all wishes, even though that also could be true. That is one way of looking at it. In particular, it is a reference to a specific aspect of a visualization that is done in the more secret aspects of this practice. When we have the full empowerment, all the necessary empowerments and transmissions, we're introduced to certain types of visualizations that we do. And one of them is indeed a wheel. There are actually multiple wills that are imagined in different facets of this practice. And one of these wills is a specific will that is referred to as fulfilling our wishes. What wishes does it fulfill? It fulfills our wishes of attaining the common and the supreme attainments, siddhi, as we've mentioned it before. So one important thing to note here, and that is because there's a lot of confusion about this, is that White Tara is not one of the 21 Taras. This specific White Tara that is known as the wish-fulfilling will comes from a different lineage of transmission than the practice of the 21 Taras, the praise to the 21 Taras, and so forth. There could be a whole class about 21 Taras, and I would love to do that at some point, actually, because first of all, there's the original text of the praise to 21 Taras, which is technically called literally called a sutra within the text itself, but is technically a tantra. It's a tantric text in nature that is preserved in Kangyur, or the great collection of the Buddhist transmitted words that is now being translated into English by the 84,000 Project. So there's a specific lineage of transmitting that text, bringing it to Tibet, spreading it around Tibet, and it is one of the most popular praises to Tara, one of the most important tantras associated with Tara as a figure. And indeed, from that original text, which can be seen as simply praising different facets and aspects of Tara, and then by extension, our own Buddha nature, there arose multiple systems that associate each of the 21 verses with a specific form. So then you have at least 5 major systems that describe these 21 Taras, which if you multiply it is, 105? But actually more than 5. It's just 5 can be seen as the most important ones. And among those 105 Taras, and there are many more, some of the Taras would indeed be white in color, but none of them are this White Tara, the White Tara that is the wish-fulfilling will. And her unique features include the fact that she's sitting in the full lotus posture. So the lotus posture that we know from yoga, where her legs are fully crossed, is one unique visual feature of hers. She has 7 eyes in that she has 3 eyes on her face, the 2 regular eyes, and then the 3rd eye, and she has an eye, a symbolic eye, on each one of her palms and on each foot. So altogether you have 2 on her feet, 2 on her palms, 3 on her face, altogether 7 eyes. So full lotus posture, 7 eyes. And then there's some additional aspects of imagery that are added in the more secret parts of this practice. But in general, these are 2 identifying features. Full lotus posture, 7 eyes. These are unique features of this wish-fulfilling will Tara, who is not, once again, one of the 21 Taras, even though there are many white Taras who are white in color among the 21 Taras of different systems. It's only much later in Tibetan history that these 2 systems were brought together. And so sometimes now you can find White Tara practices which include the 21 praises to Tara as well. But even now, it remains quite rare. There are specific instances of that. One specific tradition that I will mention later that does that type of practice in this day and age, but that's quite rare because originally these texts were separate. They were taught separately. So what's the lineage of transmission for this wish-fulfilling will, lady? So first of all, why to study lineage in the first place? Knowing about the lineage of a specific practice helps us see its authenticity, the fact that it was not invented by Michael Lobsang-Tenpa 15 minutes ago. And it tells us that others have applied the same methods and realized certain results. So there were other practitioners who invested hours, dozens of hours, hundreds of hours, years into these practices, and then they had a chance to report accurately on their accomplishments or on what happened within their practice. Usually they're not able to report on it immediately because in the Tibetan tradition, there's this wonderful ethical principle of being a secret yogi, which means that we should never talk about our meditative experiences, accomplishments, and so forth with people in general. We should only share that with our teachers, who would then be able to guide us skillfully, but we should not advertise. And indeed, if you look at the great yogis of the tradition, they never advertised, except in the situations when they were told to advertise by their own guides, by their own spiritual guides. So I've already mentioned Blazing Splendor by Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche. Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche was, first of all, he was the father of Mingyur Rinpoche, Tsoknyi Rinpoche, Chökyi Rinpoche, Chokling Rinpoche. For that reason, he was also the grandfather of the Korondilgo Khyentse of Pakchok Rinpoche. So he was known in Nepal as Lama Factory because his offspring are all these great, wonderful masters that we now know and meet in places, not only of spiritual practice, but in institutions like Google and so forth, where they are sometimes invited to speak about meditation and so on. So Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche not only, of course, gave birth to all these incredible lamas, he was an incredibly accomplished lineage holder, according to other lineage holders of his time. But when asked about his own accomplishments, he said he knows nothing, has accomplished nothing. All he can do is recite Om Mani Padme Hum, and that's kind of most of what can be received from him. The only other thing is that he can share some stories about the great masters that he had the fortune to meet, and that's exactly what he does in Blazing Splendor, sharing those stories. So he was an incredibly humble yogi and a great example of this. But because these lamas are able to share some of these experiences in private, sometimes with students, sometimes with their own teachers, sometimes with trusted fellow practitioners, that's how we still have all these stories preserved to this day. And for that reason, we do have quite a lot of miracle stories about how White Tara affected the lives of these great lamas of the past. And sometimes we also have miracle stories about how our fellow practitioners in this day and age receive benefits from White Tara. Sometimes there's a way of telling these stories without at all sounding grandiose. And for example, the great master Garchen Rinpoche, who is still very much alive, still very much teaching the practices of White Tara, he tells about how his life was saved by White Tara on 7 or 8 occasions. We'll include that document, the PDF, with that when sending out the materials. But that's a good example of how we can talk about the benefits of White Tara practice without at all making it sound like it's a spiritual accomplishment of ours or something that we've earned or some wonderful facet of our own realization. Not at all that. It's the inflow of Tara's grace more than anything we've done through our side. That's seen as an appropriate way of sharing these stories. Be that as it may, it's just enough to say that there's quite a lot of inspiration that we can receive from these descriptions of the lineage, and that's why they're in place. For that reason, quite a lot of Tibetan Buddhist practices, when done in their traditional setting, and that's kind of a thing that is slowly dying out in the West, or started dying out and now it's being revived to a certain degree. In a traditional setting, all of our meditations would be preceded by a prayer addressing the lineage. That's also done to a certain degree in the Zen tradition. Sometimes you would see the practice of bowing to all the Dharma ancestors, It's done in Japanese Zen, and sometimes even in San Francisco Zen Center. Yeah, I've seen examples of that. So you do at least one bow to each specific Dharma ancestor, and that brings you up to your immediate teacher. It's a kind of a similar idea. So you would have these prayers in which you would start with a historical Buddha or a trans-historical Buddha, like Prajnaparamita or Samandabhadri. We talked about them already today. And then you go down the lineage all the way up to your immediate teacher, and you try to invite what's known as the inspirational force or blessings, Adhisthana in Sanskrit, Jinlap in Tibetan. That's the inspiration that is able to transform our mind. That's what it refers to. That's one other reason to study the lineage. One is to not be colonial, to establish authenticity, to become grateful, and so forth, to do sort of a land acknowledgement, but in the domain of spirituality. And another reason is to indeed receive this inspirational force from each lineage master and from the lineage altogether. So here's the lineage for the transmission of this specific White Tara practice. First of all, we can say to a certain degree that from the historical view of the Mahayana tradition, all Tara practices in this day and age originate with our historical Buddha, or Buddha Shakyamuni. So the traditional account is that Buddha Shakyamuni revealed or voiced such teachings as the teaching of the praise to 21 Taras, some dharanis associated with Tara, let's say mantras, certain mantras associated with Tara, certain praises to Tara, and all of those presumably transmitted by the historical Buddha are now preserved in the Kangyur, the great collection of the Buddhist translated words. Some of them have already been translated into English under the same project that I've mentioned before, the 84,000. So those are attributed to the historical Buddha because he voiced them. But then there's a larger attribution saying that actually originally some of these teachings were voiced in the cosmic realms by, for example, another Buddha, Buddha Vairochana, let's say, for the 21 praises to Tara. Buddha Vairochana voiced them, and then Buddha Shakyamuni repeated them for us, because all the Buddhas are sort of in a telepathic union with each other, and they can retransmit things in that manner. So Buddha Shakyamuni was sort of the gateway through which some of these Tara Tantras, Tara Sutras, Tara Mantras entered our realm. And then for a certain period of time, they were presumably transmitted in ancient India through monastic and non-monastic practitioners alike. And eventually, they came to an Indian master, Indian yogi or Indian Mahasiddha, actually, because he had quite a lot of accomplishments, so it wouldn't be a mistake to label him as a great accomplished one, called Vagishvara Kirti. So Vagishvara Kirti was specifically a master who had incredible prowess in the systems of practice that had to do with longevity, with healing, and with prolonging our lives. He had quite an array of different mystical or visionary experiences associated with that specific aspect of spiritual practice. And he put them all down into writing, or he compiled them as a system of teaching. And that system of teaching included the teachings that he received in his meditative connection specifically to White Tara. So Vagishvara Kirti received the original long lineage of transmission of Tara practices, coming presumably or reportedly from the historical Buddha, but then he practiced with that, and he practiced so powerfully that the gateways of realization opened for him, and he received some unique and special teachings related to White Tara. And for that reason, he then becomes the originator of this wish-fulfilling wheel Tara practice. That is not at all uncommon, because actually all the great tantric lineages that came from India, of all the tantric practices, similarly sort of start with the Buddha, the historical Buddha, or somewhere in the trans-historical realms of cosmic Buddhas, but then they enter the gateway of actual history through the great Mahasiddhas. So for example, the practice of the 1,000-armed Buddha of compassion of Avalokiteshvara enters our realm through princes known as Lakshminkara. The practices of Vajrayogini, great female Buddha, who is a purified expression, who is an expression of purified attachment, enter our realms through such Mahasiddhas as Tilopa and Naropa. and so forth. You have similar examples for all the great tantric practices that entered our realm. They enter our realm first through the Buddha or Buddhas, but then through a great Mahasiddha. Mahasiddhas are the originators of the Vajrayana tradition. Male, female, kings, monastics, there are many of them, and they all gave us something unique. So Vagishvarakirti gave us the practice of Vaitara. There's another female Mahasiddha that we will also name a little bit later. So it's a fusion. But Vagishvarakirti gave us practice of Vaitara. It was transmitted in an unbroken lineage up to a certain degree, and then it spread sufficiently where several masters in India inherited it and were able to individually bring it into Tibet. So it became sort of widespread in India to a certain degree, and then from there it was able to enter Tibet through 6 individual lineages, 6 individual lines of transmission. So sometimes these are in sort of essentialized as the 6. Sometimes they are described even more elaborately. You can say there's 9, but here are the 6. The most important are the first 2: the lineage of Atisha, the lineage of Barilatsava, the lineage of Ngokulatsava, who was actually connected to Atisha to a certain degree. And there's Nakrichen Lodzava, or Vanaratra in Sanskrit, Nien Lodzava Dharmadrak, and Naljorpa, which literally just means yogi. But this Naljorpa was specifically a specific student of Atisha's. And he brought Vaitara practice, which is connected to Atisha's lineage, but he had his own unique things within it. So these are still seen as the 6 main ones. There are some that appeared in Tibet a little bit later on. So that's why sometimes you receive 9. You would see 9 lineages listed. But the most important are the Atisha lineage and the Barilotsava lineage. Why are they important? Lineage of Atisha, and Atisha was this great Sanskrit scholar, yogi, practitioner who came to Tibet in the 11th century and brought some very unique teachings to Tibet to revive the overall understanding of how Sutra and Tantra connect to each other. What's the totality of the path leading to full awakening? What are some of the practices to progress towards full awakening? What are some of the practices to transform problems into the path? Atisha is so quintessentially important for Tibetan history that knowing about him and his teachings is a great boon. But one of his great legacies is Vaitara practice, actually. So that's one reason for why we should be grateful to him, even though people usually focus more on his teachings on the path to enlightenment and transforming the mind or mind training. Vaitara is a very important thing that he also transmitted. So that's his lineage, and that entered the school that was established by his student, or by his students. That's the school of Old Kadam. And then from Old Kadam, this teaching of Vaitara spread into the Kagyu tradition and eventually also into the Gelug tradition. And in the Gelug tradition in this day and age, for example, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama transmits Vaitara practices, quite often the reliance is still on Atisha's lineage. They still come from Atisha's lineage of transmission. Barilotsava's lineage came into the Sakya tradition. Barilotsava is the great originator of the Sakya tradition, which is very much alive and flourishing in this day and age. Incredible, noble lineage of yogic practice and learning. And Barilotsava's lineage is preserved within the Sakya tradition with a lot of clarity, beauty. It is still practiced very powerfully in this day and age. And so some of the best Vaitara teachings you could receive are from from the Sakya tradition. And I will name some masters in the modern day Sakya tradition that you could connect with to receive the Barilotsava lineage of these empowerments. The other 4 sort of spread out and then eventually dissolved into the 2 primary ones. And eventually, you also had some masters, including Tsongkhapa, who took all of these transmissions and brought them back together. So at least on one occasion, I had the fortune of being present in a Vaitara empowerment that the late Lama Zopa Rinpoche was giving. And that specific empowerment that he was giving was based on some texts by Tsongkhapa, and those texts were uniting all these lineage of transmission back into one empowerment that would transmit all 6 in one, because they are all very close to each other. They all depict this same Tara with 7 eyes sitting in the lotus posture. The differences between them are minor. They're the differences in literally how this practice came to you, and differences in tiny aspects of visualization. So that's what brings establishes the difference between them. But if you were introduced to, let's say, Atish's lineage, you studied it, you practiced it a little bit, and then you were to go for a Bodhisattva transmission, you see it's very largely the same. The differences are completely. So for that reason, masters like Tsongkhapa were able to bring them back together on occasion. And so there's also lineage that combines them all into one transmission as well. Whichever one of these you receive, they would all be referring to the same practice, but whichever one you receive, even if you receive multiple ones, that's what I had the fortune of doing, you would, for doing the actual practice, have to decide which of the ones to rely on. For the introductory type of practice that we're going to do today together, doesn't matter, all the elements would be the same, but for the detailed practice that you can do after receiving a Vaitara empowerment and transmission, you would need to rely on specific practice liturgies or specific practice texts, specific practice scripts. You would have to decide, like, what am I doing today in this specific session? Am I going to use the text from the Bodhi lineage or from Atisha lineage, from this specific master, from that specific master? It's just, you need one script for a specific play. You don't just take all of Shakespeare's plays and perform them all together on the stage at the same time, even though you could say they cover the same material in a way, saying human nature, suffering, and human insanity, and human kindness, and all of that. True, but a specific play is used for a specific performance. Same here. You would choose a specific system to work with in particular over a period of time to actually gain some results. However, these 6 lineages are not the only thing included into Vaitara practice. At a certain stage in history, Vaitara practice became fused with some teachings on longevity that originally were connected to another Buddha of long life, Buddha of infinite life, known as Amitayus. And the teachings on that practice, on the specific practice of Amitayus that is still preserved in Tibet to this day and practiced also, came through a great female Indian yogini known in Tibetan as Machi Drupe Gyalmo. That's how Tibetans recall her. Her Sanskrit name was probably Sitarani. And she transmitted her lineage of long life teachings, of longevity teachings to Rinpoche, who was one of the 2 primary students of Milarepa. Milarepa is the greatest yogi of Tibet, as many people would know, the great cultural hero of Tibet. So Milarepa sent Rinpoche at one point to India so that he would collect some teachings there that Milarepa had not the fortune of receiving himself. And amongst those teachings was this teaching on longevity that Rinpoche received from Sitarani. In fact, Sitarani saw Rinpoche, according to some accounts, sort of in a marketplace and said something in the nature of, oh, who's this little Tibetan? You're about to die. Like your life force is very severely damaged. You need a long life practice. So she then transmitted to him the teachings of Amitayus, or Buddha of infinite life. Rinpoche practiced them, realized them to a certain degree, and then brought them back to Tibet, transmitted them, shared them back with Milarepa, probably with some other fellow students. And then eventually through Rinpoche, these teachings became quite widespread. They're still transmitted in the Kagyu tradition in this day and age. And some aspects of that practice became incorporated into Vaitara practice. These are special visualizations that are associated with invoking the energy of the 5 natural elements, invoking the life energy that we have lost along the way, invoking the restored energy of commitments and so forth. Sometimes that is all described anthropologically as soul retrieval. That's an anthropological term that came to be associated with such practices, even though, of course, as many people would know, Buddhists don't really believe in a soul per se. So that becomes a bit of a confusing term. But some Tibetan masters actually do use that because that is a fixed entity in the anthropological world. So this practice of laguk and seguk, which literally means invoking the vital energy and invoking the longevity energy, these are part of Vaitara practice that came from this great yogini called Sitarani. And within the Tibetan world, there are theories that state that Sitarani is actually Princess Mandarava. So Rinpoche came to know this female master as Sitarani or Machigdrupe Gyalmo. But originally, she was Princess Mandarava, who was one of the 5 great female students of Padmasambhava. She was an Indian princess, originally was doing princessy things and then wanted to practice and attain awakening, and her parents were sort of resistant. And she eventually received the permission to practice while being surrounded by multiple female attendants. And then Guru Rinpoche came to teach her, and they engaged in all kinds of tantric practice, and the royal parents learned about that, and there was all kinds of scandal around that. And then they tried burning Guru Rinpoche, and that didn't really work because you can't really burn Padmasambhava. And then he transformed his pyre on which they were trying to burn him into the lake, now known as Tsopema, which you can visit in quite close to Dharamsala in India. And he and Mandarava went to Nepal, to cave of Maratika, where they practiced methods of longevity, realized the city of immortal life, and eventually parted ways because Mandarava was already fully trained. She was a fully enlightened being in her own right. So because she was immortal by then through practicing these methods, later on, a couple of centuries later, she met Rinpoche, told him her name was Siddharani, or he believed her name was Siddharani, transmitted the same teachings, and so forth. So from that point of view, we can also state that according to some interpretations, these teachings incorporated into the Vaitara practice come from the great Indian princess Mandarava, and or a great female Siddha named Siddharani. Either way, it's quite universal, this practice, quite a lot of elements. So these are our Dharma ancestors, in a way. So if you do Vaitara practice, you are relying on the inheritance of Vagishvara Kirti, of Siddharani, and then of the great lineage masters of Tibet, starting with Atisha and Bari Lodsawa, and then going through Gampopa, who was the primary student of Milarepa. He practiced Vaitara extensively, and then coming through many, many generations of practitioners, including Tsongkhapa, very powerfully coming through the lineage of the Dalai Lamas. First and the second Dalai Lamas had very strong connections to Vaitara. Actually, all of the Dalai Lamas have a strong connection to Tara in general, to Vaitara in particular. And I was told that His Holiness the Dalai Lama does Vaitara practice every day. Sometimes publicly he says that among his daily prayers and his daily practices, there is a Tara practice. And then I asked Dr. Alex Berzin, who is one of the Dalai Lama's translators and close assistants over multiple years, whether he thinks this is a green Tara practice that His Holiness is doing or some other form. He says he believes it would be white Tara practice that is commonly done by Lamas to establish a certain interdependence for the longevity so that they continue bringing benefit to all beings. For that reason, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is one of the, once again, primary masters to turn to if you ever want to receive a white Tara transmission. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. So these are the transmission elements for this specific thing, white Tara wish fulfilling will practice. If you have received it ever in the past, if you will receive it ever in the future, you will be getting the blessings automatically from all these lineage lamas. But you can expand on that, you can strengthen that by thinking of these great practitioners of the past, by invoking their inspiration. So let's just do a tiny, tiny meditation on that, just a couple of minutes, well, a few minutes. That's a very simple thing really to do. This is what we would be doing if we were chanting a lineage prayer together, but we're not doing this in this moment because actually, even if you have received white Tara transmission, some would have received it from the Atisha side, some from the Bari Lodsawa side, some a fusion, there's multiple versions there. So there's not one lineage prayer that would work for all of us. However, what we can do is first observe our breath for a little bit, or just the sensations in our body, releasing tension. Allowing our breath to flow smoothly. Bringing a greater degree of relaxation to our feet and toes, to our hands and fingers, the shoulders, the face. allowing our body to breathe naturally, to continue breathing on its own as it's finding an optimal rhythm in each given cycle of breathing. And on the level of our mind, thinking of the incredible Dharma ancestry that we have. Everything that we're discussing here today came to us because of these great practitioners of the past. First of all, none of this would exist without the historical Buddha, Buddha Shakyamuni, and his incredible teachings. So we can turn our mind towards the Buddha, thinking of him as a living energy field that pervades entirety of existence and guides all beings to this day and age, and inviting that inspiring force to enter our heart and mind. That can be done either by simply opening up to it or by mentally invoking that inspiring energy and quite literally saying, "Inspire me in my practice," or "bless me in my practice," as it's more commonly translated. And then feeling that the Buddha's inspiration flows into our heart and mind, and by extension also into our body and into our speech, and waters the seeds of these practices, of these qualities, of these methods. And then the great Indian masters, Agishvara Kirti, Mandarava or Siddharani, the father and mother of these transmission lineages for Vaitara. And then Atisha, Parilotsava, Ngokladzava, and many others. The first Dalai Lama, the second Dalai Lama, and so forth, all the way up to our immediate teachers, some of whom spent decades practicing Vaitara. Seeing that entire gathering of great realized beings, knowing that their Buddha nature and our Buddha nature is of the same taste, once again, we address them by thinking, "Inspire me. Water the seeds of my practice. Help me open up more. Bless me to realize the practice of Vaitara." And then not just asking for that, but imagining and feeling that the flow of inspiration indeed does water the seeds. It's a flow of warmth and spaciousness. From our side, there is an appreciation of this Dharma ancestry. From their side, certain degree of warmth that can affect us positively. And the more we open up, the greater that warmth that is available to us. So as Venerable Rabina once again sometimes says, may the flow of their blessings stream into our heart. And then returning to the body, just to notice how it's feeling right now. Once again, adjusting our breath to make it completely natural. And then slowly concluding to return to our shared space. You. So if we were to do this once again in a more traditional context, and some Dharma organizations would give us a text that would include a lineage prayer, we would be reciting the names of these masters in that lineage prayer, addressing them with the idea of them sending their inspiring energy, their inspirational energy, which is sometimes translated as blessings, quite often actually. And then the idea would be that with each act of inviting that and accepting that, receiving that, opening up to that, we become more and more flexible. Our mind opens up to a greater degree, and we see greater and greater glimpses of our own basic goodness coming to us through the window that is, in this case, Vaitara, wish fulfilling will. So that's the idea, and that's the overall description of this lineage, starting with Buddha Shakyamuni, ending with our immediate teachers. We have multiple teachers that we can still receive Vaitara practice from, but we shouldn't take that for granted either, because at any point things can shift. That has happened multiple times already. There were some transmissions and empowerments that were easy to get in the 80s and that are almost impossible to get right now. There were some practice transmissions that were easily available 10 years ago and are not almost not available right now. Literally over the last 3 months, 5 masters of incredible caliber in the Indo-Tibetan world have passed away, including Zopa Rinpoche, Trungpa Rinpoche, Otrul Rinpoche, Togden Rinpoche, Phlam Ladakh. There's constantly someone dying essentially on this planet, obviously, but when it's a great lineage holder, we then say, oh, I wish I took the opportunity to visit them. I wish I took that teaching from them. And some of those teachings are available online for free, just literally need to open YouTube at a certain hour. So not to take any of that for granted, and not to think that these things will be available indefinitely either. We never know, Did I imagine myself as a sort of refugee? Could I imagine that when even the pandemic happened? Could any of us imagine the pandemic happening? Some did, visionaries did, but beyond that, who knows? We're living in samsara and it's changing very fast. So to make the best use of what we have available to us right now, that includes Vaitara practice. There are other Vaitara system practices, not Vaitara wish fulfilling will, other Vaitaras that we can encounter. If we look at the overall fabric of Tibetan Buddhism, here's 3 other Vaitara systems that we can sometimes encounter in this day and age. Actually, beyond that, there's many more, but these ones are sort of still transmitted and preserved. The first one is the system called Chime Pagme Ningtik, the heart essence of noble immortal Arya, meaning Tara. Tara is noble, she's Arya, so she's immortal, and the heart essence is the name of this teaching. That's what's depicted on this tanka. It's a unique system in which Vaitara appears in union, or so-called reverse union, with her divine consort, referred to in that system as the Lord of Dance, not to be confused with Michael Fletchley, the Lord of the Dance. In this case, it's a reverse union because she appears as the main figure. The male is sort of sitting on her lap and all of that. They're surrounded by some additional deities. It is still a system that is transmitted in Nyingma and Sakya traditions, very powerful system of practice, but it's separate from the Tara wish fulfilling will that we have been talking about so far. There's also a unique practice of Vaitara within the Dujom tradition, which is a sub lineage of the Nyingma school. was originally revealed by Terton from a visionary from the past, and then Dujom Rinpoche Gyalgeshe Dorji, who was a great master of the 20th century, rewrote some of it and made it more concise and accessible. So it's also sometimes transmitted even in modern day America. It's a different lineage, different practice, also very powerful, but different. Then there's some Waitara practices that were revealed by the 5th great Dalai Lama and his pure visions. They are, of course, still held by his Holiness the current Dalai Lama. One of the holders for that lineage actually is Khandro Tseringma, who did teach in Tibet House the other week. So there's also potentiality for these teachings being shared at some point as well. But once again, that's a slightly different system, even though that one actually would be closest to the wish-fulfilling will Tara that we've been talking about. All of that to say there are actually other systems of Waitara practice, but absolutely the most common one is the wish-fulfilling will that we have been talking about so far. That's why we're focusing on it instead of these other ones. But not to be confused. You might receive a Waitara practice that is from a different system, different logic, different explanations, different teachings, just a different system of practice. Doesn't mean it's more or less powerful, might be more powerful, might be less powerful. That depends on many, many factors. But at the end of the day, what's important is that we have received it, we have practiced it, and we for ourselves have seen whether it works or not for us personally. So when we do Waitara practice, for example, in the wish-fulfilling will specifically system, we would quite often see this mantra. Sometimes people think that this mantra, Om Tare Tutare Ture Mama Ayu Punya Jnana Pushtim Kuru Swaha, is the so-called white Tara mantra. And the mantra Om Tare Tutare Ture Swaha, or Om Tare Tutare Ture Soha, as it's commonly pronounced by Tibetans, is the green Tara mantra. That's actually incorrect, technically speaking. Colloquially speaking, we can say that, but technically speaking, not so much. Om Tare Tutare Ture Soha or Om Tare Tutare Ture Swaha is a mantra that is, I'm just going to share it in the chat just in case, is the so-called root mantra for all taras. And we could spend some time describing what each tare or ture, like which these three words refer to. There are different symbolic explanations of it. And some of them, for example, it would be said that they help us realize, because there is a threefold repetition of this word, root, tra, tare, tutare, and ture. This helps us cultivate the three principal aspects of the path, which we have already discussed. Renunciation, bodhicitta, wisdom. There's three tras there. There's three principal aspects of the path. It will grow within us with each repetition. There are many other interpretations that we can explore as well, but that is a root mantra for most taras, or for all taras in a way. So it's not specifically a green tara mantra, even though it is very commonly used within green tara practice. That same mantra is also used in white tara practices quite extensively. This other mantra, more elaborate one, which is sometimes called white tara mantra, Om Tare Tutare Ture Mama, and so forth, the one that's here on the slide, is actually the activity mantra associated with white tara. What does it mean? The root mantra, Om Tare Tutare Ture Soha, is taken, and additional words are placed within it. So Swaha gets pushed all the way to the back. Additional words are added, Mama, Ayu, Punya, Jnana, Pushtim, and Kuru. And we receive a mantra that helps us activate specific facets of the interdependence within which we exist, or specific aspects of the interdependence that we are. So that's why this mantra is used, to manipulate the threads of interdependence that we are made of, or within which we are bound to all other beings. How do we manipulate the threads of interdependence? We first call on Tara in general. Om stands for the enlightened body, speech, and mind, A, U, and Ma. And Tare Tutare Ture is a threefold supplication to Tara, or a threefold calling out to Tara and all the stuff that she represents on the transhistorical, universal, and individual levels. I've talked about that already. And then Mama, Ayu, Punya, Jnana, Pushtim, and Kuru is a specific formula that is quite important for white Tara practice in particular, because Ayu stands for longevity. It's the literal Sanskrit word for Ayu, or Ayur is a specific Sanskrit word for longevity, or long life force, or long life energy, which is why in some Mongolian tribes, including Kalmykia, Buryatia, and so forth, Ayur is a common name, which just means longevity. It's a Sanskrit word for longevity. Then you have Punya, which is merit, or positive potential, the positive imprints and the positive energetic traces that we create in our mind or in our karmic force field by doing actions associated with compassion, with love, with generosity, everything that belongs to the so-called method side. And method side is everything that is good, that is not wisdom. So compassion, once again, love, generosity, all of that, bliss, they are all on the method side. So punya covers all of those. And jnana covers the side of wisdom. However, because in Sanskrit, there are different words for wisdom, prajna, jnana, or jnana, as it's pronounced in the northern branch of Sanskrit pronunciation. Jnana here in Tibetan, for Tibetans, would be primarily interpreted as primordial wisdom, a more underlying type of wisdom that is not so much about using our intelligence to discern different facets of reality. That's what prajna stands for, discerning wisdom or discerning intelligence, but rather the underlying knowing of all that is. Erik Pema Kunsang translates yeshe or jnana as wakefulness. And that is not etymologically precise, but it definitely conveys very beautifully that idea of just being woke enough to know the nature of reality. So that's the type of wisdom that is referred here. So when we recite this Vaitara mantra, and many elderly Tibetans and Mongolians would just do that as their primary practice. Most use Om Mani Padme Hum as their primary practice, but you would also have some focusing on Vaitara for that specific type of practice. Just walking around a stupa, for example, the Bodhanath or Swayambhunath somewhere in Kathmandu, or a temple or a monastery, or just sitting at home, sitting in the sun on a bench. You can see a lot of that happening in Dharamsala on the big circumambulation route around His Holiness's private residency and the main temple there. You would see them just sitting there, clicking their rosary beads and reciting these mantras hundreds of thousands of times, millions of times. Quite a few elderly Tibetans accumulate Om Mani Padme Hum 100 million times at least, and some of them do that in many sets. It's a very powerful and transformative mantra type of practice. So some do that with Vaitara mantra, and so with each bead they would be repeating Om Tare Tutare Ture Mama Ayu Punya Jnana Pushtim Kuru Swaha. So okay, we've established that Ayu is longevity, Punya is merit, and Jnana is wisdom. We need longevity so that we live long enough to attain the common and supreme cities. But the way to actually gain common and supreme city or accomplishments is through merit and wisdom. They need to be perfected, we need to accumulate them to the greatest possible degree, and then that would transform us into the fully awakened state of a Buddha. So we're inviting longevity as the preliminary condition, punya and jnana as the actual conditions. And what do the other words stand for? Mama here just stands for me. So my longevity, merit, and primordial wisdom. Pushtim means to multiply, to increase. May they be, pushtim kuru, may they be increased. Swaha, may it be so. So Om, Tara, Miss Tara, Lady Tara, may my longevity, merit, and primordial wisdom be multiplied. May it be so. Essentially, that's what this mantra translates into. So in specific Vaitara liturgies, you would have this mantra and the root mantra of Om Tare Tutare Ture Swaha used in different combinations. Some lineages say that you need to recite this mantra as the primary one, and then you use the shorter one, and you accumulate just the 10% of the number that you've done with this long one. And in some systems, it's reversed. You do the root, the short one, billions, like millions of times, and then you do this longer one, just the 10% of that you need to accumulate of the bigger number. So that just means either version could work. You would be doing what your specific lineage of transmission tells you to within that specific liturgy, within that specific system of practice. Either version is correct. It's just different approaches to doing the same thing. And you would also see that sometimes the words are put in a different order. There's a specific lineage, one of the 9 lineages, if you use the more elaborate enumeration, the Gar monastery lineage, and that's where Garchen Rinpoche comes from. And within that, the Punya and Jnana are reversed. So you would have Om Tare Tutare Ture Mama Ayu Jnana Punya Pushtim Kuru Swaha. What does that mean? Because Gar Monastery is very strongly associated with practices of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, practices that take us straight into the ultimate nature of the mind, and then merit flows from there. Within that system of practice, it makes perfect sense to first try to connect to the primordial wisdom, the ultimate bodhicitta, and then have the conventional compassion, love, conventional bodhicitta, generosity flow out of that. So for that, you're first connecting with primordial wisdom, and then you're allowing compassion to flow from there. Whereas in some other systems, you start by connecting to compassion, and you allow compassion to melt the ice of your mind, so it becomes the freely flowing water of awakening, and within that, you experience primordial wisdom. Nagarjuna was also quite strongly associated with Tara practices in general, even though he's more closely associated with the 21 Taras, presented that dualism or the dichotomy in his very important text called Praise to Bodhicitta, which His Holiness the Dalai Lama teaches every few years, Bodhicitta Vivarana. Within that, he said that some beings need to first cultivate compassion, and then they will gain the ultimate wisdom. But the especially gifted individuals can first go into the primordial wisdom or ultimate bodhicitta, and from there, the conventional side will flow. Means both approaches are correct, they're just suitable for different individuals. So for that same reason, different versions of Vaitara's mantra are also correct. And once again, you would just be practicing whichever one you feel the most connection to in terms of your lineage. And if you received both versions of this mantra, let's say you received this transmission from Garchen Rinpoche, and there you have Ayu, Jnana, Punye, and then you receive this transmission from, let's say, Sakya Trichin Rinpoche, the head of the Sakya tradition. And in the Sakya tradition, it's, as it's written here, Ayu, Punya, Jnana. Which one do you do? Well, whichever one you want. You rely on a specific practice text and recite that. Either one is absolutely correct. It's just, there's flexibility, there's playfulness, there's dancing there involved in these practices. And the logic is the same. You still need all the three components to live long enough to do some practice, and what the practice consists of merit and wisdom. When we have brought the accumulations of merit and wisdom to completion, Dr. Alex Berzin translates them as networks. Traditionally, they're called accumulations or collections, but what does it mean? Does it mean we have like two little banks within our mind, like a HP bank or a mana bank? For those of you who are RPG players, you have like your wisdom energy and your merit energy in these two jars, and you accumulate them, and once the jars is full, you suddenly become enlightened. Well, kind of like that, but it's not as primitive as that, and that's where describing them as networks is a very beautiful description of it. You have an interpenetration of all the factors associated with quote-unquote method, and you have the interpenetration of all the factors associated with wisdom, with insight, with clearly knowing what is and what is not. So when those two interpenetrations, which support each other, have been brought to their ultimate power, they have been fully energized, that's when awakening happens, and your body, speech, and mind become the body, speech, and mind of, let's say, Vaitara. So that's what we're aiming for. And the mantra is helping us progress towards that. It's literally using its magic, which just means interdependence. There's no magic involved here. It's using its power of interdependence and of configuring interdependence to push us towards that specific progression on the path. Accumulation of collection of merit and sublime wisdom. Yeah, accumulation or collection or network of merit and network of wisdom within our mind. That's what we're strengthening with Vaitara practice. Because longevity also comes from merit, you could say that longevity is just a specific expression of having merit. Actually, to dwell on that topic of merit, which is quite important for all Vajrayana practices and just for Buddhist practice in general, that's why people do circumambulations, offerings, and all these prostrations and all these other practices to purify and to accumulate merit. Merit is just described as a specific type of karmic energy that allows us to get things done. Merit is what makes sure that our wishes get fulfilled. So we have a wish, and then it gets fulfilled. I had a wish to successfully reach Mexico City, which is where I am right now. And that's my very belated land acknowledgement. How did I get here? If I had zero merit, according to this theory of karma, and that's very practical, we can test it, I could try for a billion years and it would not happen. But then you would see people who they get a certain wish, they get a certain vision for a project, let's say, and then very soon, very smoothly, it gets fulfilled, it gets realized. So there's a lot of thinking that goes then into accumulating these types of karmic force so that it can propel the fulfillment of our wishes. And those wishes would ideally be wishes affiliated with the idea of eventual enlightenment and with strengthening compassion, wisdom, and so forth on the way there. So that's why there's so many accumulation practices within the Tibetan tradition. And Vaitara practice includes quite a few of those. Within Vaitara meditations, we would be making imaginary offerings to Tara, and each offering would represent a specific subset of merit that we need to progress along the path. We would be offering the entire universe to her in what's known as mandala offering. We would be praising her, and there are actually Vaitara praises written brilliantly by such masters as the first Dalai Lama, for example. Once again, all of that to strengthen those karmic forces, those facets of energy within our body, speech, and mind. Not because Vaitara needs bananas or our praise, really, or really needs anything from us, but because all of those are skillful methods to strengthening those facets of our own mind. So this is where we return to this idea of positive imagery, because our name for the class is the power of lineage. We have talked about that. Basic goodness. That is exactly what we're looking at through the window that is Tara, or that we are fostering through the container that is Tara. There are two interpretations of Buddha nature within the Indo-Tibetan tradition and within Buddhism in general. One of them is the so-called discovery approach. The other one is the so-called cultivation approach. And the cultivation approach let's return to the mantra for that. That's actually quite good. In the cultivation approach, our Buddha nature is described as primarily being a potential. Not simply potential, but primarily a potential. We already have the seeds of compassion, love, and so forth. They're not yet fully powerful. They are not yet the oak tree. They're just the oak seed. But if we nurture them with water and sunlight and all the necessary conditions, one day they will turn into an actual oak tree. And that oak tree is our own full awakening. So Buddha nature is seen as a Buddha embryo. That's one way of translating the original Sanskrit term, Buddha Garbha. The other one, ironically, is to translate the same Sanskrit term, Sugata Garbha, as womb. The same Sanskrit term can be translated as embryo or womb, which is quite ridiculous in a way, but incredibly powerful in this case, because it means that we can see our Buddha nature as something that is in the process of gestation. It will grow, it will expand when we give it proper conditions. Or it can be described as just the space that already includes everything. We just need to realize that space. We just need to understand that we are in that space. So that's the discovery approach. Instead of trying to grow stuff, we just need to polish the mirror. We just need to remove the veil, and we're already there. And the fullness of compassion and wisdom is already there. It was always there. Awakening was always there. We just were not realizing that. The dance of these two approaches was also actually quite clearly present in the Chinese tradition. If you have read ever about the great Chan debates, especially associated with the sixth patriarch and all of those sort of figures, there was quite a lot of dancing between people who thought, no, enlightenment needs to be cultivated, and people who said, what is there to cultivate? So either approach could be fine, and it describes reality in an accurate way, but we need to use them according to our propensities at each individual moment. And the same with the Tibetan tradition. The Gelug tradition, to a certain degree, the Sakya tradition, they emphasize the cultivation approach, even though there are exceptions within those lineages as well. And Kagyu Nyingma traditions emphasize the discovery approach. So for that reason, putting jnana first is kind of more reflective of the discovery approach to Buddha nature, to basic goodness. Putting punya first is more of a sign of emphasizing the cultivation approach. But the thing is, each individual practitioner can benefit from the cultivation approach and from discovery approach on the different stages of their practice. This is quite brilliantly shown by Milarepa, because Milarepa's first teacher was a Dzogchen yogi, a yogi of the Great Perfection tradition, who gave him a quintessential instruction of the cultivation of the discovery side, basically amounting to the fact that just realize that enlightenment is already there. And when you realize that, if you realize that in the morning, you'll enlighten in the morning. If you realize that at night, you'll enlighten at night. So Milarepa heard that, went into a barn, leaned down on a pile of hay, and just started chilling. And when the teacher asked him, what the hell are you doing? I just gave you an instruction. Milarepa said, oh, I just thought it means I need to chill. I just thought it was already all there. Isn't that what you said? And the master said, unfortunately, that means I can no longer teach you because your mind has become insensitive to my instructions from now on. You've made yourself insensitive by misinterpreting this instruction. So you go to that guy Marpa there, and he's going to torture you for some years, putting you through a lot of cultivation practice before he will actually also really reveal the discovery approach methods to you. So it wasn't that the discovery approach was wrong altogether, and it wasn't that the cultivation approach was wrong altogether. It just Milarepa needed them at different stages of his practice, and the same goes for all of us. So that's something that is already present there in Vaitara practice. But when we're doing the cultivation thing, and to a certain degree the discovery thing, Vaitara practice is equally helpful. And the third element in the name of our class today, the power of positive imagery, is described here by Tulkutunda Rinpoche, who's one of the most brilliant translators of the Tibetan tradition in this day and age. He's written some wonderful books on loving kindness. He has a few books on loving kindness. He has a few books on healing in Tibetan Buddhism and healing meditations. He has a few books about death and dying. He has incredible books about Buddhist history, especially of the Nyingma tradition. He's made wonderful translations of multiple sources related to the Great Perfection tradition, and really is a very insightful teacher and author. And quite often when teaching these different meditations used for healing or for activating loving kindness and so forth, he presents this module, which is sort of unique to him, but is fully traditional in nature, of 4 essential tools. These are 4 essential tools that we rely on when we're doing Vaitara practice, for example. So the first element there is positive images. Positive not in that they represent some frivolous joy. So it's not positive images as in like, oh yes, visualizing $1 billion is positive because I want $1 billion. You know, it's not that. It's positive in that they represent the beautiful qualities of our heart and mind. I remember on one occasion, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, was talking about spirituality, because spirituality is a very confusing concept, actually. What does that mean, spiritual, right? Because some people say they're spiritual, but they're completely non-empathetic, not kind, that just use spirituality as sort of to feel superior and arrogant. So what is spirituality? And His Holiness said, well, for me, spirituality just refers to the best qualities of human heart. So, which I think also is a brilliant definition. So from that point of view, positive here means referring to those beautiful qualities. So imagery that represents wisdom, that represents compassion, that represents love, empathy, patience, generosity, ethical discipline, nonviolence, and all those sorts of things. We can make our own list of these positive qualities. We can refer to the Buddhist list. People know that probably that Benjamin Franklin had his own list of different virtues that he was trying to train in, you know, and they're all kind of universal, common, and logical. So whatever represents that is positive imagery. So a good example of positive imagery is a lotus flower. It's not a deity, doesn't have hands and heads and all of that. It's just a flower, but it does represent something. In the Christian mystical tradition, a rose is a positive image because it represents multiple beautiful things. You know, the opening of the soul and the enlightening energy of Mary once again, and so forth. There's many types of symbolism associated with these sorts of things in different traditions. So these are all positive images. The image of a heart, you know, is a positive image. An emoji can be a positive image. So something that represents these qualities. And among those is Vaitara herself. Vaitara, in her form in which she's sitting in the full lotus position with her 7 eyes, is a positive image. This specific image is considered to be extremely sacred. It is the tanka that used to belong to Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, who was this incredible non-sectarian master in the 19th century. Blazing Splendor has a whole chapter about him. And Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo in particular was a great master of Vaitara practice. He composed some literatures for it. He's the forefather of the non-sectarian movement in Tibetan Buddhism in general. So one of the sources of inspiration for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, amongst others. And Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo had this tanka, which, according to his contemporaries, was a talking tanka. So we can understand that in whatever way we want. We can be very materialistic about it and think, well, maybe Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo looked at it and received inspiration, and then some good ideas came to his mind. We can be a bit more mystical about it and think that realized masters can indeed converse with Buddhas even through their images. We can have many different interpretations of it, but that's the same tanka. I think it's still preserved. That's like an image of that tanka all the way from the 19th century. So this, once again, some beautiful seeds we're receiving right now as we're looking at it. So that's positive imagery. Tara here is surrounded by 6 auras of different kinds. That's one of the aspects of the secret part of this practice. It is the seal of secrecy there has been somewhat lifted, especially by a wonderful Lama by the name of Gelek Rinpoche, who was living in the United States and teaching there for many years. He taught Vaitara practice very extensively. His instructions on it are brilliant. They're still preserved, transcribed, and so forth. His instructions come from the Atisha lineage. So he'd introduced some forms of practice in which even an initiate, a non-initiate practitioner would be able to visualize these 6 auras. But once again, that's positive imagery. All these lotus flowers and beautiful natural environment around it and natural beauty, positive imagery. Okay, something that represents these qualities. And we need to know what these are representing. So originally, when we're introduced to things like Vaitara practice, we would not know the symbolism of it, but eventually we can learn. There are sources and texts and descriptions and charts for it. So slowly, we accumulate the understanding of it. Then the next thing is positive words and thoughts. So once again, words and thoughts that would reflect the qualities of wisdom, compassion, and so forth. Vaitara mantra is an example of positive words and thoughts. That's why there's a certain importance associated with understanding individual words in that mantra, if possible. Not all mantras have meaning like that, but Vaitara's mantra certainly can be interpreted in the way that we did. So once again, these are positive thoughts. But beyond that, these are also positive thoughts of the different prayers, or what we did in the preceding meditation, which we just in our heart said, inspire me, help me open up more. These are positive thoughts and words. Then positive feelings and experiences are things that we sometimes think might arise on their own, and sometimes they would, but also things that we can catalyze by, for example, imagining that we are opening up to a great degree, or imagining a way of warmth that starts pervading us when we connect to the lineage or to Vaitara. So it is something that is not verbal in nature, and yet it is still, and also not visual, so these are not images, but it is still very important because it still connects to those beautiful qualities and affects us on a deep level. We are affected by visual imagery. It's one of the primary channels of perception available to some of us, not all of us, of course, but to many of us. Then we are affected by words and thoughts, very importantly, but we also are affected by feelings. For example, the feeling of being safe, the feeling of being relaxed, the feeling of being tense on the negative side. So here we are trying to connect to the positive feelings, consciously, doing it intentionally in those practices. So once again, when you hear these practices guided by such masters as Tulku Tondup himself, he has a wonderful Green Tara meditation on SoundCloud that we will include for your benefit if you want to experiment with that. There would be references to also the feelings. And finally, the trust. Trust here refers to trusting that positive images, thoughts, and feelings are present, and they do have certain efficacy. They have a way of affecting our mind, our heart, and our reality. And one of the teachers that I've received Tara teachings from, by the name of Lama Chönam, is a wonderful translator that works in the United States, Tibetan. He works in the Bhutanese, actually, I think. Works in the United States together with his companion, Sangye Khandro, He's a wonderful translator in her own right, and also a master of Tara practices. So one time when talking about Tara practice, he said, and it might sound very kind of simple, but I think it's a brilliant idea. He said, when we're doing practices like Tara practice or any other deity practice, we need to rely on them as we rely on a washing machine. What does that mean? When we put stuff into the washing machine and we start the cycle, we kind of know that by the end of the cycle, if everything was working properly, we would take out clean clothes, or at least they would be cleaner than originally, right? We don't expect the cycle to complete and the clothes to be as dirty as they were, or even dirtier. No, we know something is going to happen. We have a lot of trust in that. I don't doubt that most of the time. So that's why if something did happen with the cycle, we are surprised. Oh, why is it not clean? So actually the same should be our attitude towards things like Tara practice. By the end of a specific meditation, we should feel and trust that things have shifted, even if they shifted a tiny bit. We affected the interdependence. We introduced new factors into it. We pumped more wisdom, more compassion, more love, more positive imagery, thoughts, feelings into interdependence. Therefore, things are no longer the same. They have been changed for the better. And there should be a certain level of trust towards that. Otherwise, our practice will lose a lot of its power. And we could say, well, isn't this placebo effect? And that's where we have to say, it is exactly placebo effect, meaning it's the power of our mind. All of these methods are ways of working with our mind. We are accessing the power of our mind, and by extension, the power of our Buddha nature, which is the deepest aspect of our mind, by having such things as trust. It is the placebo effect. But in this case, we're not accessing this placebo effect by being given sugar pills. We're accessing it by doing meditations that involve these four essential tools. And the fourth essential tool is the power of trust. That's why we also need the lineage, and to understand why Tara's form and different aspects of her visual aspect and what it means to recite her mantra and what's the meaning of these different prayers and so forth. So that's something that we explore over time under skillful guidance and through reading different books and so forth. And with that, our trust is becoming stronger. Our access to positive images, words, and feelings becomes easier. And eventually we arrive at the level in which Tara practice, each time we do it, and dedicated practitioners would of course be doing it at least daily, and then by extension, sometimes spending time in retreat, in which they would be doing 4 or 6 sessions a day of Tara practice. All of that becomes an exercise in transformation. And slowly, slowly, through the cumulative power of it all, we become more and more like Tara and the great lineage masters that have realized Tara, starting with Vagishvarakirti and Mandarava. So that's something that we can exercise in. And let's do a tiny bit of meditation on that. A very simple form. Something that's accessible to all, regardless of having and not having an empowerment. So once again, maybe stretching a little bit if we need to, and then eventually finding a comfortable stationary position. For this practice, because we'll be visualizing Tara in front, probably better to be in an upright position, but whatever's available, we do what we can. And the first step there is just to bring our attention into the body, to start observing our sensations. Releasing physical and mental tension with each exhalation. Focusing our attention on the body with each inhalation. briefly reminding ourselves that the main goal of these practices is to become fully awakened for the benefit of all. But along the way there, we might gain such qualities as greater degrees of wisdom, greater degrees of compassion. Maybe greater longevity. And then from this aspect of simplicity in which we're abiding in a state where there's no particular images yet, we allow for those images to appear, seeing ourselves as being surrounded by a beautiful natural environment that reflects different facets of wisdom and compassion, with verdant fields, majestic forests and mountains in the distance, streams of water, and so forth. And in the open blue sky in front of us, a symbol of our mind's spaciousness and clarity, on a fragrant lotus flower in a flat moon disk appears white Tara herself. A window into our actual nature, connected to Tara as a trans-historical being, and representing the universal facet of Tara, the underlying wisdom and compassion at the heart of reality. She's sitting in the full lotus posture. Her right hand is on her right knee, palm up. Her left hand is at her heart, holding the stem of a beautiful flower. And there are 3 eyes on her face and an eye on each foot and on each palm. Her gaze is loving and compassionate. And in fact, it's so deeply personal that we can feel the energy of that gaze entering us, because Tara knows all there is to know about our heart, body, speech, mind, our potential, our unique karmic history. All there is to know. And in this moment of connecting to Tara, we can share with her internally, mentally, our heart's deepest desires. First, our desire for the greatest possible happiness and well-being, for freedom. But on a more instrumental level, maybe also our desires that have to do with the here and now. World peace, or such boons as health, longevity, or maybe simply not feeling so lonely, or knowing what to do. And as we pour our hearts out Tara's compassion and wisdom start flowing towards us. Visually, we can see them as light and nectar that enter us, bringing us those blessings. Verbally, we can recite Tara's shortest mantra, which is just her name in the vocative case, Tare. Mentally, we open up to the experiences of warmth, spaciousness, and transformation. Losing that strong grasping, that strong sense of isolation. And for the fourth tool, there's the trust that it's all happening. Because all the elements are there, and some transformation will inevitably take place. So we'll do just a few recitations of Tara's shortest mantra. Or it's absolutely fine to also just listen. Tare, tare, tare. Tare, tare, tare. Tare, tare, tare. Tare, tare, tare. And just like the longer mantra and the heart mantra, Om Tare Tu Tare Tu Re Swaha, this shortest one is always available to us now. We can combine it with our breathing. We can recite it quietly, loudly. We can chant it. It's going to be one of the ways of connecting to Tara's energy. And so we imagine that the form of Tara in front of us melts into boundless light. This boundless rainbow light enters us through our crown, blessing our body, speech, and mind with union, meaning that our body, speech, and mind, Tara's body, speech, and mind, and the body, speech, and mind of all the realized lineage masters have one taste. And we dedicate the energy of this practice to our highest spiritual aspirations and to the well-being of all who live. And then we conclude. So that's a very simplified version of Tara practice that can be done without any initiations. There are much longer versions, and we will include just one longer guided version, which would include the summoning of the elements from Siddharani's tradition. That's the recording for that. But I'll just allow myself to steal a couple more minutes of your time to talk about the ensuing stages for those who want to eventually get Tara empowerment and start practicing on a deeper level. So for that, you would need to connect to a qualified lineage holder. And of course, as many people would know, that starts by knowing what it means to connect. What is it to establish a connection to a spiritual teacher? And also starts with checking on that spiritual teacher to know that they are indeed a qualified holder of the lineage. So there's two considerations there. Fortunately, Dr. Alex Berzin, following His Holiness the Dalai Lama's desire, compiled a wonderful collection of materials on the relationship with the spiritual teacher. So we'll include the link to that. It's part of his Study Buddhism website, which is an incredible source of information on all sorts of things Buddhist. There's a wonderful detailed description of what's a Lama, what's the connection between a student and a master, what kind of qualities does master have, And what's the difference between a professor of Buddhism and an actual guru in Buddhism? All of those sorts of things. So within that, we'll explore all of that, hopefully. And then to actually start doing Vaitara practice, historically, we would need to receive empowerment. That's still necessary for these deeper levels of visualizations where we would imagine ourselves as Vaitara and so forth. And in the most proper way, we would receive 3 types of transmission. Actually, several. But for the empowerment, we would first, that's a description more closely associated with the Gelug lineage, but it's kind of universal in a way. We would first receive a great 2-day empowerment into a major meditational deity, for example, 1,000-armed Chenrezi, or medicine Buddha. But it would be like a long, elaborate empowerment, which would involve us entering the mandala and all these sorts of things. So that would be the basis for then receiving actual Vaitara practices. And then we could receive 2 types of Vaitara empowerment. One is a Vaitara subsequent permission, or Jenang, Jesunongwa in Tibetan. And that's essentially the permission to see our body, speech, and mind as the body, speech, and mind of Vaitara. Another type of Vaitara empowerment, and these are very commonly given even by Geshes, sometimes, certainly by many Rinpoches, is a so-called Tsewang, or long life empowerment. And that's more of a ceremony in which the elements of our body are blessed for us to have just some greater longevity, for some of the obstacles to our long life to be eliminated. So ideally, historically, we would get first a great empowerment, then a Vaitara Jenang, and a Vaitara Tsewang, and with that, we would have a full collection. And that would be then combined with receiving instructions on Vaitara practice. We would be given a specific Vaitara practice text, and we would start working with it. In this day and age, the system has become somewhat simplified. So it's not uncommon for people to just receive a Vaitara empowerment itself and to be allowed to do Vaitara practice. Because that's what's done by the masters, I am absolutely not a person to say, oh, no, that's not correct. I'm just saying that historically it would be more elaborate, but we live in the day and age where sometimes these more condensed versions are available. And some masters even transmit that online. Avalokiteshvara, yes, that's the question in the chat. Oh, sorry, there's a misprint here. Yeah, so some of the masters that you can connect to in terms of Vaitara practice that are really great. I'm just going to drop these names in the chat as opposed to the slides. Just talk about them very briefly. So first, 2 great female lamas. Jetsun Chime Luding is the sister of His Holiness Sakya Trichin Rinpoche. She's a great practitioner of Vajrayogini living in Vancouver. She has a few Dharma centers, but she also gives Vaitara practices and teachings. She's quite senior now, and I don't think she's teaching very often. But if you are in that area and if you manage to catch her, wow, what an incredible opportunity. Another great female lama, Dagma Kushog. Dagma Kushog Sakya. She lives in Seattle. She's associated with the Sakya monastery in Seattle. She sometimes travels, including to Hawaii and some other places. Once again, receiving, and she's considered to be Vaitara, an emanation of Tara, actually. A very well respected, great female lama. Once again, receiving that from her, absolutely incredible. She's quite senior. So if you get a chance, grab it. Then His Holiness Dalai Lama sometimes gives Vaitara practices. Not that often now online, but one never knows. So keep your eyes open with regards to his schedule. Then the head of the Sakya tradition, the father, Sakya Trichin Rinpoche, and then his 2 sons, Ratnavajra Rinpoche, Gyanavajra Rinpoche, who are the Sakya Trinzen or Sakya throne holders of this day and age. Also wonderful sources for the Bari-Lodzawa lineage of Vaitara. There are many other great Sakya lamas as well who transmit these Bari-Lodzawa teachings. Luding Rinpoche and some others. And then finally, Garchen Rinpoche is a wonderful source of these teachings. He teaches Vaitara very openly. He allows people to take Vaitara empowerment, not only online, but even by means of a recording, which makes a lot of sense because Dharmakaya transcends time and space. So if you visit the Garchen Institute in person in Arizona, or if you visit their website, their YouTube channels, you can explore a lot of Vaitara materials there as well. These are just suggestions. There are many more lineage holders, and it's our responsibility to first check the compatibility, check the qualifications, check ourselves, check the potential master, and so forth. But eventually we can receive those transmissions and then start practicing. So the question here about Thupten children, Venerable Children does not give empowerments. herself. She wrote a wonderful book about Tara, which will be included in our links. And she does teach on Tara practice. She does not give empowerments on Tara practice. So she's a wonderful source for explanations and materials. But to receive an empowerment, she would also send you to some of these masters. And in fact, when Shravasti Abbey, which is the monastery established by Venerable Thupten Chodron, needed Vaitara empowerment, they invited Dagma Kushok Sakya from Seattle, from Sakya Monastery in Seattle, to receive those transmissions. So yes, these are some of the sources to explore, and I hope that all of this has been inspiring. You absolutely can practice the open methods of Vaitara even without an empowerment, the basic forms that we have practiced today together. There's some recordings that we will send out, and hopefully it will all bring joy and benefit. Yeah. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and deep bows of gratitude to Beata and to Tibet House for hosting us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. What an incredible session. I wish everyone the very best continuation for this day or evening, wherever you are. Thank you for coming all the way from Mexico City. We really deeply appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, and see you soon. Bye-bye.